Hidden Paws by Corinne Winters, Book 9 of the Kitten Witch series. For the ad-free version or to get the rest of the series, pick up the audiobook at Corinne Winters' Cozy Mystery Bookstore by going to cutecozymystery.com. Be sure to use discount code CUTE40 to take 40% off. Chapter 1. Emerald lightning flashed across the blood-red sky, seeming to Ember's eyes like the Grim Reaper's skeletal fingers grasping at some luckless mortal on the ground below. The air tingled with energy, creating a static buzz in Ember's magical senses. "Ash, what have you done? Where are we?" She turned to her grinning sister. Ash's crimson-dyed tresses flew about in the gusty breeze, obscuring her eyes. She swept a hand over her face to clear her gaze. "I've brought us to the dimension where Etrix hid Cedric's memories. That's what I've done. You're welcome." Ember's eyes widened. "Ash, dimensional travel is dangerous. Like less than half the witches who try it ever return home. We shouldn't be here." "Don't you want to get your husband's memories back?" Ash's pleading, glazed eyes spurred Ember to action. "Okay, I can't discuss this with you if you're high," Ember grumbled. "Hold still." Ember brought to mind a cleansing spell, one which would clear her sister's body of toxins. She extracted a pinch of sulfur from her purse and spoke a single, harsh syllable. Ember threw the sulfur at Ash. It ignited mid-air, causing Ash to yelp and recoil. The resulting smoke wormed its way into Ash's nostrils. "What?" Ash bent over in a coughing fit. The smoke returned, but with a sickly purple tint, the remaining fairy death's head toxins in Ash's system being expunged along with the sulfur cloud. Ash ceased coughing, raising up and staring at Ember with lucid eyes. "What was that?" "I need you sober, Ash," Ember said, casting a fearful eye skyward. "I cleansed your blood of the remaining fairy mushrooms. You're lucky that you just got exposed to it instead of being a long-time abuser, or it wouldn't have worked." "Stinking Krebs," Ash grumbled. "Still, even if I hadn't been on mushrooms, I'd have brought us here straight away." "Would you? You're lucky I have my purse, so I've got spell components." Ash sighed. "Yeah, I guess you're right. I wasn't thinking. Look, sis." Ash dug around inside her shirt and produced a green crystal pendant. "We've got our way back home. Guaranteed. I break this, say the appropriate command word, and bam, instant portal back to our dimension." Ember grimaced, her eyes staring at the red skies above. "Ash, you haven't asked why I want you sober yet." "I've got a divining rod that will lead us straight to Cedric's memories, Ember." Ash shook her head. "And what are you going on about?" "Is it just me, or are those dragon things getting closer?" Ember asked, pointing at the skies. Ash stared up, her eyes wide with dawning realization. "It's not just you. There's more of them, too." Ember pursed her lips in worry. Whatever dimension Ash had deposited them in seemed hostile. The blasted, craggy landscape consisted of sundered, cracked plains and sheer, jagged cliffs rearing up hundreds, maybe thousands of feet in the air. If there were any water or vegetation to be found, Ember saw no evidence of it as yet. The bleak landscape offered no place to hide, no strategic advantage against a flying adversary. Ember didn't like their chances. The reptiles in the sky bore a saurian aspect, like the medieval concept of dragons, but their humming wings appeared more insect-like. Their wings created a dull roar in the air, which grew louder all the time as the creatures circled in. Worst of all, each dragon was the same size as a Greyhound bus. "How's your weather magic these days, sis?" Ash asked. "So-so," Ember replied. "If you're thinking we can blow these things out of the sky, I'm not sure we have the power, even working together." Ash glanced over at Ember. "Have you looked at this place? I mean, with your witchy eyes?" Ember frowned. "No, it was too intense. I turned it off." "Turn it back on and look for ley lines." Ember closed her eyes for a moment and coaxed her magical senses back into awareness. Her jaw gaped open. Jagged lines of silent, ivory energy ran through the ground, the sky, everywhere. There must not be any magic users on this world, Ember stammered. Or not very many. Ash grinned. What about it? You want to send these dragons on an all-expenses-paid trip to the land of Oz? Ember nodded. She held Ash's hand and they began a chant. The winds picked up in tempo, swirling into a circle around them. Gritty dust twisted up from the land and obscured the winged creatures from view. They chanted louder, stronger, Ash's grip on her hand threatening to break it. Power surged into them from the abundant ley lines. The cyclone grew larger, widening until they stood in the center of a maelstrom more than 100 feet in diameter. Ember stared upward, seeing numerous green blobs caught up in the tornado's hungry embrace. They tumbled about, gossamer wings torn into mutilated shreds. Ash, we have to let it go. We haven't got them all yet, Ash gasped. It's getting too big. We can't control it. Already the tornado screamed at them for more power, more energy. It existed to devour. That is why they birthed it. It didn't understand why they didn't just fuel it to hurricane size. You're right, sorry, Ash said. They released hands, cutting off the flow of power to the tornado. It screamed as it died, a wrenching sound that echoed off the jagged cliffs and filled the sisters with a deep sense of despair. Ember and Ash stood panting in the center of a series of concentric circles. The winds had been so fierce they'd scoured the very rock beneath their feet. Ember glanced up in the air and shouted, Ash, look out! She tackled Ash, driving them both to the hard, unforgiving rocky ground. A split second later, the mangled corpse of one of the dragon things thudded to the ground where Ash had stood. Thanks, Ash said. They looked around as more bits of dragons rained down. Ember's heart sank when she saw more than a dozen of the things remained. The sudden windstorm had killed many and driven away the rest, but not for long. Already they amassed for another try. Ember panted, going down to one knee. Ash barely kept her footing, bending over to rest her palms on her knees. Been a long time since I channeled that much power, Ember gasped. More of them are coming, Ash said, offering her hand to Ember. We have to do something. Like what? If we try to use more magic now, we'll burn out. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be a lich. Then we're going to die, Ash said as the dragon thing swooped ever lower in the blued skies above. Chapter 2. Run! Ember shoved Ash forward as the pair broke into a gallop. She caught glimpses over her shoulder of a dragon beast swooping in low, its fanged maw spread wide enough to swallow them both. The insect-like wings droned into a painfully loud cacophony. Ash saw it too. She skidded to a halt on the hard, rugged terrain, pivoting to face the dragon. Ash, don't! Ember gasped. You can't channel more magic now, it'll kill you. I've got no choice but to try, Ash said grimly. A crackling blue barrier appeared in the air, forming a half-bubble around the sisters. Not a moment too soon, Ember saw, as forked green lightning spewed from the dragon's cavernous maw. Ash's shield lit up like the midday sun. Ember threw her arm up to protect her eyes. When she looked again, the barrier had fallen, but she and Ash were unhurt. The dragon flashed past overhead less than 10 feet above them. Ember and Ash flew back under the brunt of the sudden wind gust left in the creature's wake. Get up, there's another one about to strafe us, Ember shouted. She grabbed Ash's hand and tried to tug her sister up. Ash mumbled something, her eyes fluttering closed. She fell limp and boneless back to the rocky terrain. Ash? I told you not to channel magic again so soon. Ember thought of the pendant. If she broke it, then they could return to their own dimension. Only Ember didn't know the command word, and Ash was in no shape to tell her. She drew magic from the ley lines and added it to her own reserve, preparing to cast a final, protective spell which would keep Ash safe for a little bit longer, at least. Maybe long enough to wake up and break the talisman and gate them home herself. Before she could utter one word of the spell which might very well kill her, a rapid, coughing rattle reached her ears above the incoming dragon's droning wings. The dragon's eyes squeezed shut. A roar of agony escaped its maw as blood erupted in gouts all along its right flank. The wing on that side exploded into gossamer shreds. The dragon dipped down and crashed hard, sliding along the craggy stone and leaving blood and scales in its wake. Ember shrieked as its massive maw slid along the ground, growing closer and closer until it seemed it would still devour them even in death. It ceased the slide at last, and Ember nearly fainted with relief. She looked about, hearing the repeated coughing coming from all around now. Men in green uniforms appeared in organized ranks, setting up defensive lines and fending off the dragons with machine gun fire. Ember's mouth gaped open. "Where did these guys come from?" she gasped. "Is the military here?" Ember deflated in relief. "Ash, you're okay." "I think so. My head hurts like nobody's business, though. Is the military here or what?" Ash held a hand over her eyes, face contorted in an agonized grimace. "I don't think so. These guys are speaking another language. Chinese, I think. And look at their uniforms and their rifles. These guys aren't from our time, even if they are from Earth." The soldiers only managed to fell one more of the dragon things. It spiraled to the ground and crashed out of sight beyond a craggy ridgeline. The others fled, seeking easier prey. "They won," Ember said. "Yeah, but that doesn't mean they're friendly." Ash's voice bore a drum-skin-tight anxiety. One of the soldiers moved in, his eyes glancing between them with, to Ember's mind, more concern than suspicion. His hands were spread out, palms open wide, as if to show he bore them no malice. Greetings?" Ember said as he approached. She stood up, squeezing Ash's shoulder one last time. "You speak English," the man replied, seeming surprised. "As do you, sir," Ember replied. "I'm Ember McNair, and this is my sister Ash. Thanks for saving us." The man smiled. "It's our job to defend Driftwood's borders and its people. That includes newcomers like yourselves. I'm Captain Yang. Nice to meet you." Ember gaped. "Newcomers? That implies this happens with some frequency. And what's Driftwood?" "So you'll be among the 20,000th people to appear here," Yang said. "So I suppose it does happen with some frequency. Driftwood is the settlement made by people who wind up here, through no fault of their own." "And you guys pull together for the common good?" Ember asked. "Yes." She flinched as Yang stepped forward, but all he did was help her lift Ash into a standing position. "Can you walk? Driftwood's a few miles north of here." "I think so," Ash replied. Yang handed her a canteen. Ash took a long sip, her face contorting in disgust. Yang laughed. "You'll get used to the taste of the native water soon enough. I don't even notice it any longer." Ember arched an eyebrow. "How long have you been here?" Yang pursed his lips. "Just a moment." He turned about and barked out a series of orders to his men in Chinese. They picked up their machine guns and lined up for the march back to Driftwood like a well-oiled machine. Yang turned back to them and sighed. "It's hard to say. There's no sun here, no seasons. It is hard to judge time. If I had to guess, 50 years? Ember scoffed. "Impossible. You're 30-something, or I'm an 8-legged toad." Yang cocked an eyebrow at her strange analogy. "No one ages in this dimension. Children reach adulthood, and then they stop growing." Ember and Ash exchanged glances. "I wonder how time passes back in our world." "No way to tell. The talisman should bring us back to the exact moment we left, though." Ember sighed. "All right. I guess for now we should go back with these guys." Ash shook her head. "But the divining rod is telling us to go in a different direction." "They know their way around here a lot better than we do," Ember replied. Ash sighed. "All right, you've convinced me." They followed the soldiers for a mile through a twisted landscape of rugged canyons, sheer cliffs, and sudden, plunging cliffs leading to terminal falls. Neither sun nor moon shone in the skies above. Lightning flashed and the clouds billowed, but not a drop of rain fell upon them during the trek to Driftwood. "Look," Ash gasped, grabbing Ember's shoulder. Ahead of them lay a strange city made of oddly shaped structures. As they trudged closer, it became apparent the buildings were slapdashed together out of various scavenged materials. In some cases, a building consisted of a ship hull turned on its end, doors and windows carved out of its metal chassis. "Do you think you can make it the rest of the way on your own?" Yang asked. "My men and I need to find out why the dragons are swarming so close to Driftwood. If something's riling them up, it could be trouble." "I think we'll be fine," Ember said. "Thanks for your help. Is there someone specific we should talk to?" "Mayor Earhart will get you squared away. All newcomers are entitled to basic housing. It may not be fancy, but it'll keep the rain out." "It rains?" Ash asked. "Sometimes. I wish you well." "Thank you, Captain. Thanks again for saving us." They parted ways. Ember and Ash walked toward the city. "See there," Ember pointed. "They're growing some kind of crops in fields outside the city walls." "I see what looks like steam-powered generators, too," Ash said, gesturing in a different direction. "These people have managed to cobble together a decent existence for themselves, all things considered. I wonder how they keep ending up here." "The walls between dimensions can grow thin in places. Sometimes a particularly powerful spell cast on one dimension can warp two or more together as well. In this dimension's case, I'd say it's been primarily plucking people from Earth, like the soldiers." "And like this guy," Ash said, pointing ahead. "Look." A trio of men broke away from a building made of a dismantled city bus and strode toward them with purpose. The man in the lead appeared clean-cut, even dapper. He wore a nice, if dated, suit and a thin smile. "Welcome, newcomers," he said. "Welcome to Driftwood. If you'll just hand over your entry tax, we'll let you go along on your way." "Entry tax?" Ember frowned. Captain Yang didn't mention an entry tax. "Well, his job is killing monsters. My job is collecting entrance tax. What can you do?" He shrugged. "So if you'll just hand over everything you have on you, we'll let you go on your way." Ember gripped her purse protectively. "We're not going to do any such thing." The man sneered, his fellows cocked old-looking but functional rifles. "Then you ain't setting foot in Driftwood." Chapter 3. Ash shifted her stance subtly, bringing her left arm partially in front of her body. Ember knew Ash prepared to use her shield spell. Risky, but catching bullets would prove riskier still. Ember decided diplomacy might be a better approach. "Excuse me, who are you again?" Ember asked. The man's thin lips stretched into a smile. "Most folks around here call me Coop. Depending on what era you came in from, you might know me as D.B. Cooper." He puffed out his chest proudly, and the men behind him rolled their eyes. "Wait, the parachute guy?" Ash asked. Coop's eyes widened. "The parachute guy? I, a criminal mastermind who executed the only successful hijacking in history, am remembered as the parachute guy? I take it you got whisked away into this dimension while you were on your way out of the plane?" Coop's eyes narrowed. "How do you know this is a different dimension? Most folks who get caught up in Driftwood think they're hallucinating, or in hell." Ash snickered. "We're not most folks. Now, it's true that we're new here, but I know a shakedown when I see one. You're a criminal, Coop, and we're not handing over anything." "Wanna bet?" Coop snapped his fingers. The men behind him leveled their rifles at the sisters. "Now, I'm trying to be nice about this. If you push me, I might have to act not so nice." Coop's eyes ran up and down the girls' forms. Ember felt anger boil up in her belly. She prepared her own magic. Magic meant not for protection, but for hurting. Ember's body was worn, having channeled too much magical power already. Yet when she opened herself to the abundant energy flowing through the strange dimension, something muffled the burn. Something dark and cool and soothing. What? Coop said, taking a half step back. Ember felt his fear, snacked on it like a hungry child. It fueled the shadowy insulation protecting her from the magical burn, allowing her to channel even more power into her magic. "Ember, stop!" Ash cried. "You're—" Ember didn't see a need to stop. Her intended spell had been a minor cantrip, to heat the metal of the guns to the point the men couldn't hold them any longer. Instead, she toyed with the idea of incinerating the men's hands instead. Yes, without hands, they would be less of a threat. No, the thought. They must burn. They're criminals. Bad men. They deserve it. Ash grabbed Ember's shoulder and leaned in close, her voice a harsh whisper. Ember, I know it feels really good right now, but you're channeling dark magic. Do you hear me? You need to stop. You don't want to end up like Cassandra, do you? Dark magic? Ember shook her head, releasing the flow of energy back into the wild. She deflated, leaning hard against her sister to keep her balance. Coop and his men retreated a dozen feet away, unsure if they should attack or keep running. Ember saw a pair of men riding out toward them on irregular patchwork motorcycles. Coop looked in the direction of the motorbikes and grimaced. That gave Ember hope. If Coop didn't like them, they were probably allies. The men rumbled to a stop and dismounted their iron steeds. Their garb seemed rough and simple, but the silver stars pinned on their lapels were unmistakable. Coop, 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 said the first of the motorcycle men, his mustachioed face pulled into a genial smile. What has Mayor Earhart told you about this entry tax malarkey? Cassidy, you tell that breeches-wearing broad that I could care less about what she thinks, Coop said with a snarl. He gestured at the sisters. 2 more mouths for Driftwood to feed. It's only fair they give up their equipment to the greater good. The mustachioed man spat into the dirt, his smile fading. Last time I checked, I'm not your messenger boy, Coop. My purview lies in another specialty. He flicked the star on his chest with a metallic ting. Ember moved over next to Ash and whispered, I think I recognize our lawmen. You ever see that really old movie with Paul Newman? With who? I'd show you on the internet if our phones worked here. I know you've seen this movie. It won a lot of awards. You know, I always fall asleep during movies. Wait, something's happening, look. Coop's men no longer pointed their guns at the sisters. They now aimed them toward Cassidy. A silver revolver hung around the man's waist in a leather holster, but Ember couldn't see how he could draw it before they shot him dead. Looks like I've got you at a disadvantage, Cassidy, Coop said with a sneer. Cassidy twitched a smile. He turned his head slightly to the left. Kid? Ember didn't see the kid draw. She heard twin bangs, so close together as to be an echo, and the riflemen cried out as their weapons fell to the dirt. They held their injured hands and gaped in shock. Go on, get the hell out of here, Cassidy said, jerking his head toward the town. And leave your guns where they lay. The greater good appreciates your contribution. Coop and his men slunk off, glaring daggers at Cassidy and his companion the whole time. Ember turned toward the lawmen. Thanks. It's our job, ma'am, Cassidy said, his smile widening by a mile. It's not often we get newcomers these days. Some folks think the barrier between dimensions is solidifying. You're Butch Cassidy, Ember said, and then gestured at the gunslinger. And he's the Sundance kid. Kid chewed on the white toothpick in his mouth, eyes narrowing to suspicious slits. Cassidy arched a brow. You've heard of us? They made a movie about you. A movie? No kidding. Cassidy chuckled. He turned back toward the kid. Hey, kid, you hear that? They made one of them films about us. Great, Butch, the kid said with a sigh. They probably made you out to be the star. Ember hissed sympathetically. They kinda did, yeah. See? Everybody thinks I'm the sidekick, Kid said, shaking his head. Cassidy opened his mouth to speak, but a crackling voice emanated from his parked cycle. He dashed over and picked up what looked suspiciously like a CB radio, but made of carved wood instead of plastic. Didn't get that, please repeat over, Cassidy said. He waited, ear strained toward the radio. There's some kind of animal prowling around the beetstock fields. Earhart wants you two to check it out. An animal? Like a big dog. There might be a kid involved, too. Over. A kid? Cassidy frowned. What about the newcomers? Over. Ember glanced at Ash. She could tell from her sister's gaze they thought the same thing. A big dog sighting might mean Cedric had somehow followed them across the dimensional barrier. If you scared off Coop, they should be fine on their own for a bit. Captain Yang says they're cool as cucumbers. Over. Cassidy spat into the dirt. Roger that. Over. He turned to them and tipped his hat. Ma'am, sorry, but we got to skedaddle. You see that building what looks like a big boat took a nosedive into the dirt? I see it, yes. Just head on in there. That's City Hall. They'll get you settled in. He rushed over to his bike and straddled it with a long, lanky leg. Time to go, kid. Nice meeting you, Kid said, smiling especially broad at Ash. I think you have a fan, Ash, Ember said. Ash cocked an eyebrow. I don't think so, sis. He has to be old enough to be my great-grandpa. I mean, shouldn't he be old? Wasn't he from the Old West or something? Maybe time passes differently in here than outside, or maybe people don't age. With all this ley line energy around, who knows what's going on? Check it out. Ember pointed at a white structure atop a craggy butte, guarded by men in polished bronze armor. Is it me? Or are those Roman soldiers? You were always more of a reader than me, Ash replied, squinting up at the top of the butte. But they don't look friendly. I know that. Ember paused and stared up at the structure. Ash trudged on a few feet ahead, and then noticed Ember's fixed gaze. Oh no, I know that look, Ash moaned. What look? Ember cocked an eyebrow. The curious look, Ash sighed. And people think I'm the problem sister. All right, let's go talk to the Romans. I just want to know what era they come from, Ember replied. They made their way up the narrow path which wound around the hill in a spiral pattern. Ash glanced off the 20-foot drop to their left when they were halfway up. Why is this so narrow? Defensible, Ember shrugged. 2 men can hold off a legion. The stuff you know, sis, Ash said with a sigh. Read a book, you, Ember said playfully. They reached the top of the butte and faced off with the guards. Their gear had been styled after the Roman model, but one man's shield was a red stop sign, and the other spear had clearly been constructed with a golf club. Do you guys speak English? Ember asked. I do, said the guard, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Who are you? I've never seen you around before. We're newcomers. The guard sighed and shook his head. Then you are in the wrong place, citizen. I know the empire of Romulus I is grand, but you should head to City Hall. Empire? Ash looked around. What empire? You're standing on it. The guard gestured at the ground. Wait, his empire consists solely of this butte? Ember asked. It is but a stepping stone to greatness, said the guard in a tone that suggested he'd rehearsed that line, repeatedly. I see. Romulus I, you said? The guard turned to Ember. I did, yes. Can we see him? The guard sneered. No. Now get thee gone from our empire, citizens. Ash bristled. Ember took her sister's arm and tugged her along down the path toward the ground. Romulus was the founder of the Roman Empire, Ember said. The stories say he was swept away by a black cloud, never to be seen again. And D.B. Cooper disappeared, Ash replied. This whole dimension is like a dimensional dumping ground. The sisters strolled through Driftwood, taking in the strange and myriad sights. Most folks eyed them with suspicion, while the rest dutifully ignored their presence. They engaged in what seemed to Ember like a free market trade system, while prospectors brought in loads of scavenged goods from the surrounding plains. They've developed an entire society here, Ember said, based around an economy of scavenged goods from the dimensional rift. Looks like nobody's selling the food they grow. I guess they share in that. Ash pointed at a towering metal armature in the center of the settlement. It appeared almost as a giant screw, twisting slowly in place with a gentle creak. What's that thing? I don't know. Could be something to do with their water or power. They have running water and electricity here. Yeah, like you said, they've built a society, along with society's problems. We got shaken down on our way in. It all worked out, Ember said. I think we're about to be corralled toward the city hall, though. Cassidy and the kids strode toward them, their faces grimly set. I'm afraid the two of you are going to have to come with us, Cassidy said. Sorry, we were just taking a look around. You don't understand, Cassidy said, pulling his long coat back to expose his pistol. There's been a murder, and you two are the prime suspects. Chapter 4. Ember and Ash fell in behind Cassidy. She noted Kid took up a position behind them. As they passed through the town, those townsfolk who had at least been ambivalent now glared with equal malice as the rest. Who have we supposedly killed? Ember asked. Cassidy sighed. I didn't say you done killed anyone. I'm just supposed to bring you to the mayor. She'll fill you in on the details. So you don't know, Ember replied. I didn't say that, Cassidy snapped. Then who is it? Cassidy grumbled under his breath. Your friend Coop. D.B. Cooper? Cassidy nodded. Now, I for one am not too teared up about his passing. Sure, me and Kid robbed a couple of trains back in the day, maybe a few banks, but we had honor about it. Cooper wouldn't know honor if it bit him in the butt. So I take it the rest of the town doesn't share your sentiments? Cassidy heaved a heavy sigh. Thing is, Coop and his partners ran the still here in town. That alone made him popular. Getting drunk's about the only pleasure what can be had out here in Driftwood. Ember nodded. She slowed her walk enough that she fell behind Cassidy and caught Ash's eye. Ash moved over, and Ember spoke in a low voice so Cassidy wouldn't hear. Your talisman, will it open a portal big enough to take everyone with us? Ash flinched. This whole town? Size isn't the issue. Time is. The portal will only remain open for about 10 seconds. That's it. No way could we get the entire town through a 10-foot diameter hole in 10 seconds. Ember sighed. Then it's probably best if we don't mention we have a way home yet. Or at all, Ash said. Cassidy led them into the shadow of the giant screw mechanism. City Hall lay beyond, a massive WWY-era battleship turned up on its end and carved into a building. Pardon me, Mr. Cassidy, but what does this thing do? It's a water pump. Fortunately, Percy Fawcett knew how to locate the underground reservoirs and tap into them. Percy Fawcett? Ember asked. Who? Ash asked. If you didn't fall asleep during movies like Lost City of Z, you'd know he was a scientist and explorer who went missing. I can't help it if I got a C in history. I was young. I had different priorities. Ladies, if you'll come this way, please. They turned to find Cassidy standing beside the entrance to City Hall. Ember and Ash followed him into the structure. The lobby furniture had been cobbled together. Green plastic chairs from the 60s mod era clashed with a classical Victorian desk carved from a dark wood. A receptionist sat behind the desk, favoring them with a smile. Hello, you must be the newcomers, she said politely. I'd like to welcome you to our... Stow it, Jessie, Cassidy said coldly. These two are murder suspects, so don't go rolling out the welcome wagon just yet. Oh, don't be silly, these girls aren't killers, Jessie scoffed. Ember shifted from foot to foot, remembering what she'd nearly done earlier. She'd been within an eyelash of unleashing dark magic for the first time in her life. Ember stowed the memory as deeply as she dared. It wasn't something she wanted to dwell upon. Cassidy showed them to a simple but functional elevator. He dragged the cage door closed and they sailed toward the top of the strange structure. The mayor's office featured a triangular-shaped roof, due to it being located in the ship's prow. Ember's face lit up when she saw the woman with short, sandy hair sitting behind the mayor's desk. Amelia Earhart, Ember said, smiling. It's a pleasure. You've heard of me? Mayor Earhart flashed them a brief smile. I suppose you're from an era after my disappearance. We are indeed. Early 21st century. 21st century? Cassidy whistled. Y'all are practically space people. Did you ever get them jetpacks going? Sort of, Ash said with a shrug. Earhart gestured for the sisters to sit on a couch, which of course matched nothing else in the room. Have a seat, please. Now, I understand that you had an altercation with Mr. Cooper upon entry to our fair city. Yes, but we didn't kill him, Ember said firmly. Earhart sighed. I don't think that you did, but the problem is most of the town does. I'm in charge here, but my grip on power is tenuous at best. There are many factions vying to oust me. I may not be able to protect you for long. Then it sounds like we need to solve this murder, Ember says. If we clear our name, everything will be fine, right? Sis, can I talk to you for a minute? Ash drew Ember up from the sofa and over to the nearby window. We don't have time to solve a murder. We're here for Cedric's memories, remember? I haven't forgotten, Ember said, her brow furrowed. But these people have been here a lot longer. We might need their help to navigate our way to the memories, divining rod or no divining rod. All right, fine, but if we get lynched, I'm never speaking to you again for as long as I live, Ash said. Ember frowned in confusion. That's technically true? They returned to the mayor's presence. Can we see the crime scene? Have you done any forensic sweeps yet? Earhart cocked an eyebrow. Have we done what now? Never mind. You're from my future. Butch, will you escort our newcomers to the body? Then I need you to hop over to the beetstock fields. That dog thing is freaking people out. Dog thing? Ember gasped. Mayor, I think I can help you with that problem. Chapter 5. Ember stared dubiously at the 12-foot-tall, waving red stalks growing on the fringes of the city. Cassidy shifted nervously nearby, his hand on the hilt of his pistol. Beetstock, you called it? Yeah, it grows like corn, tastes like beets, and is one of our more nutritious food staples. It makes your urine smell funny, but once you get used to the taste, it's not so bad. He cocked an eyebrow at Ember. Are you sure you know this dog thing that's prowling around out here? Not entirely, but I'm about to find out. Ember closed her eyes and concentrated on the locator spell. Using her wedding ring as the focus, she sent out a pulse seeking her husband, Cedric. Her eyes snapped open as the ping returned. A grin spread over her features. Yes, I know him all right. He's on his way to us right now. Or should I say they? They? Kaylee and April are with him, Ember said. Ash gaped. Really? That's kind of troubling. You know what I mean. Ember nodded grimly. Her grimace faded when she caught sight of a magnificent silver and black wolf weaving between the waving stalks. A young girl of about 9 slipped off his furry back, holding a calico-hued cat in her thin arms. The wolf reared up on his hind legs and shifted into a ruggedly handsome man. His eyes maintained a laser focus on Ember as he stepped out of the crops. What in tarnation? Cassidy reached for his gun, but Ash grabbed his arm and shook her head. It's okay, he's with us. But he was a wolf a second ago. So he was, Ash replied with a shrug. Ember? Cedric moved toward her, arms outstretched. Ember went to him, and they embraced tightly. How did you get here? What happened? Whatever magic Ash used, it left a hole in our backyard. I went to investigate and got sucked in, along with April and Kaylee. Kaylee leaped out of April's arms and trotted over to Ember. Ember bent down and lifted her cat into her grasp. Kaylee nuzzled Ember's nose. Glad to see you're all safe. Cassidy cleared his throat. Ember laughed softly. Sorry. Cassidy, this is my husband Cedric, our foster daughter April, and the cat's called Kaylee. Everyone, this is Butch Cassidy. Cedric's eyes widened. Any relation to... Yes, Ember said. They traded tales with Cedric on their way to the scene of the crime. Cedric had used her scent to track Ember to Driftwood but had been afraid to approach the settlement and had been observing ever since. When he discovered there was a dead body, Cedric laughed. What is it about you, Ember? Everywhere you go, someone drops dead. It's hardly my fault, Ember said, elbowing him playfully in the ribs. Cassidy led them to the western outskirts of town. where a hut had been assembled out of an RV and a huge shipping container turned to form an L. The RV contained D.B. Cooper's living quarters, while the shipping container held the still which manufactured the settlement's alcohol. "Hey, Cassidy," said a middle-aged man with cunning, narrow eyes. His sharp business attire clashed with the coldness of his reptilian gaze as he chewed on a toothpick. "You gonna let my boys get back to work, or what?" Cassidy glared back. "A man is dead, Mr. Hoffa. I'd have thought you'd have more sympathy for your deceased partner." "Why?" Hoffa shrugged. "His troubles are over. Mine, on the other hand, are just beginning. If my boys can't go back to work, this whole batch will be ruined. You and your partner consume more of our product than anyone else." Cassidy cleared his throat, face growing red. "Be that as it may, you're going to have to give us a little more time." "Hoffa," Ember whispered to Cedric. Cedric nodded. "It has to be him. Guess he's not a speed bump after all." Hoffa gestured at Ember and Ash. "Aren't those the broads that killed Coop? Why are they not in jail?" Several shouts of agreement rang up from the crowd. Cassidy glared the crowd into silence. "Now hold on here. Innocent until proven guilty is our way here in Driftwood." "So get on with your job and prove them guilty," Hoffa said with a shrug. Cassidy led the party inside of the shipping container. He gestured at the floor near the still, where Cooper lay face down with a sword sticking out of his back. Ember glanced about at the storage unit turned workshop, noting one end lay open. "Does this door stay open all the time?" Cassidy nodded. "Most of the time, yeah, unless there's a storm." "And it was open today?" "Good question," Cassidy said, nodding. "I'll go ask the distillery crew, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say the answer will be yes. Excuse me." Cedric bent low and sniffed, his nose momentarily blackening and taking on a wolfish aspect. "There's a ton of sense in here. I don't detect yours, but being as I'm your husband, I doubt they'll accept my testimony." Kaylee patted around the container, her eyes wide and taking in everything both mundane and arcane. "I don't see any traces of magic around here, do you?" "No." Ember peered about, nose wrinkled in disgust. "This is going to be a tough one to crack." "What makes you say that?" Kaylee asked. "Well, the victim was found in a place with open access to all who might happen by. He was a well-known cheat and con man, and involved in the liquor trade. That kind of person amasses enemies." Ember put her hands on her hips and stared down at the body. "I wonder what the cause of death was, huh?" Ash quipped. Cedric and Ember frowned at her. "Sorry, I'm really nervous being around a dead body, okay?" "Ash has a point," Kaylee said, walking in circles around Cooper's body. "The sword looks like one of those the Roman guys were using." "Look at the angle," Cedric said, pursing his lips. "Whoever struck the death blow wasn't very tall, I'd say under 5.5 feet. That shortens our subject list somewhat." "Not as much as you might think. The FBI database states the average height for men in our era is 5'8". A lot of these folks come from prior eras where people didn't grow as tall." "Still, it's something." Ember turned to Kaylee. "Do you see anything else of interest?" "Nothing much," Kaylee said. "About what you would expect to find around a distillery. Soggy sugar trampled into the dirt, dried vomit, some kind of tobacco chew." "Don't be gross, Kaylee," Ash grumbled. "Anything out of the ordinary?" Kaylee's eyes narrowed. "There's something here. A piece of plastic. No, I think it's bone. Smells kinda like fish." Ember chuckled. "You think everything smells like fish. Might as well bag it and tag it, though I'm not holding out much hope with no forensics lab." "If we're going to solve this case without our usual resources, it'll have to be using good old-fashioned detective work," Cedric said. Ember nodded, stroking her chin thoughtfully. "You know what this means?" "I'm afraid I do," Cedric said with a sigh. "We're going for a chat with the Emperor, aren't we?" Ember nodded. "Yes, we are." Chapter 6. Ember trudged up the long sloping path to Emperor Romulus's so-called imperial territory. It felt strange, having no sun in the red sky above. She wondered where the dimension got its warmth. So far, the temperature remained consistent and comfortable. Ash considered their evidence, the gladius now being carried by Cassidy in a leather satchel. Ember had used a spell to check for fingerprints and had been thwarted. Whoever wielded the blade had either been smart enough to wipe it clean, had worn gloves, or both. "What's that sour look for?" Cedric asked as they hiked up the incline. "The fact that the murder weapon was left behind is kind of strange, don't you think?" Ember cocked an eyebrow. "I mean, there's only one place it could have come from in the entire dimension." Cedric nodded. "Doesn't make sense for the killer to leave a metaphorical arrow pointed at themselves at all. Still, we have to check it out." Ember sighed. Someone with an emperor's arrogance might be foolish enough to leave the murder weapon behind, even if it did incriminate them. At the very least, he might be able to point us in the right direction. I imagine he has enemies too. They reached the top of the butte. 4 guards jogged toward them, faces etched with angry glowers. While each bore a gladius, the same type of sword buried in D.B. Cooper's back, they remained sheathed at their sides. The shiny silver revolvers in their hands were a more than suitable replacement. "Hold, constable. Your authority means not on imperial land," said the watch commander, notable for the red plume in his helm. He eyed them haughtily and swept his arm in a dismissive gesture. "Begone with you." "Not so fast, Bob," Cassidy said. "You will address me as Centurion Maximus." Cassidy rolled his eyes. "You're a washing machine salesman from the late 20th century, Bob. You're not even Italian. State your business, knave, or be gone." Cassidy sighed. "Look, you can tell your boss." "The Emperor," Bob Maximum said with a sneer. "Whatever. Tell him that, in order to leave imperial territory, his prospectors have to cross our land. Tell him, if he doesn't grant us an audience, we'll build a wall at the bottom of this butte." "Get to stepping, Maximum Bob," Ash said. Ember slapped her sister's shoulder while Cedric and Cassidy chuckled. "Shame on you," Ember said, though she was smiling. Maximum Bob glumly went into what Romulus no doubt thought of as his palace. A few moments later, he returned. "His Excellency graciously grants you an audience, though I have been ordered to tell you, he scoffs at your threats and he does this of his own free will." "Of course he does," Cassidy said with a chuckle. "Lead on, good sir." Maximum Bob led them into the 2-story structure. Within, Ember found a general feel of ancient Roman architecture, but done with whatever materials were at hand. Some pillars seemed of stone, others of wood, one of a type of plastic, and there was one which looked all the world like glass. A row of such columns flanked a 20-foot-long red carpet. Romulus sat at the end of the carpet, wearing the ivy leaves of office on his temples. "This guy is the first emperor of Rome?" Ash whispered to Ember. "Yes, Romulus the First." "He's so small." "People were smaller back then, Ash. Stop giggling." "I can't help it. If I were wearing heels, I bet I would tower over him." While Romulus proved not to be a tall man, he had a certain piercing charisma. His mental affinity gave him an aura of presence, which more than made up for his lack of height. Ember thought he was not unattractive, seeming almost like an ancient sculpture come to life. "Greetings," he said, sweeping his arms out wide in a gracious manner. "Constable, if you'd told me your entourage contained such lovely handmaidens, I'd have granted you an audience without all your ridiculous posturing." "Handmaiden?" Ash sputtered. "How come he speaks English?" Romulus frowned. "What are you talking about? You're all speaking Italian." Cassidy shrugged. "We don't understand it ourselves. The dimension seems to translate our languages or something." "No aging, and everyone's a linguist," Cedric said with a chuckle. "They're not my handmaidens, Romulus. These women stand accused of a heinous crime, and I aim to prove they didn't do it." "Highly commendable. What does that have to do with me?" Cassidy snickered. "Funny you should mention that." He reached into the leather satchel and withdrew the gladius by the hilt. Emperor Romulus cocked an eyebrow at the sight of it, but didn't seem overly upset to Ember's eyes. "Oh yes, that thing. I was wondering when it would show up." "I take it you recognize this sword?" Cedric asked. "Yes, it went missing from my armory some days ago." Cassidy snorted. "And of course you didn't see fit to report the loss to us." "I do not recognize your authority, Constable. Besides, we all know you imbibe far too much of Mr. Cooper's product to be reliable." Cassidy's face twitched a sneer. "Funny you should mention Cooper since he's the victim." Again, Romulus seemed nonplussed. "Oh, poor fellow. I'll be sure to send laurels to his funeral." "Come on, Romulus," Cassidy said, brandishing the sword. "A sword you admit belongs to you was used in a murder. You can't tell me you don't know anything about it." "I can. I will. I do. Now begone from my presence." The guards clustered in menacingly. Cassidy shrugged. "This isn't over, Romulus." "It is for me," Romulus said, eyes narrowed to slits. "If I were you, I'd investigate your so-called mayor." "Why's that?" Ember asked. Romulus turned to her and smiled. "Because, fair one, Cooper is her former lover." Chapter 7. Ember and Cedric stepped back out under the red skies, Romulus's last words echoing in their minds. The guards accompanied them to the edge of Imperial land, which seemed to end at the terminus of the narrow patch which wound around the butte. "What do you make of the Emperor's proclamation?" Cedric asked wryly. "Which part of it?" "The part where he accused the mayor of murdering D.B. Cooper because they used to be lovers?" Ember laughed. "Oh, that part. Well, I suppose anything is possible, but Romulus is bending over backward to point the finger at someone else. Anyone else. If she did have a relationship with Cooper, that would make her instantly suspect." Ember cocked an eyebrow. "Because people don't usually murder strangers, right?" "Right? This is all assuming that Romulus wasn't lying through his teeth, of course." "There's only one way to find out." Cedric gestured toward City Hall. "Ask her about it in person." "She might not take kindly to us dredging up her past." Ember pursed her lips thoughtfully. "Still, we have to say something. If we don't, someone else will. And she might be a suspect." "Cedric, please. She's a feminist icon and a famous pilot. I doubt someone like that would commit murder." "Look around you, Ember," Cedric said, impatience showing in his tone. "Look at this place. Lightning storms, scarce water, dragon attacks. You never know how this place might shape someone, might change them." Ember sighed. "You may not be wrong, but my gut tells me it's not Romulus or Amelia Earhart we should be investigating." "Who then?" Ember shook her head. "There are as many suspects as there are stars in the sky. Back home, that is. Is it day or night?" "I don't think it ever changes," Cedric replied. They met up with Cassidy again a block from City Hall. Many of the townsfolk continued to eye Ember and Cedric with suspicion. Cassidy tipped his hat to Ember and faced Cedric. "Do you believe that sword was stolen from Romulus as he says it was?" "It does seem awfully convenient," Ember said, "especially considering they didn't report it to anyone." "Pardon me, ma'am," Cassidy said stiffly. "The menfolk are talking right now." Ember's eyes went wide. Cedric laughed and took a step back. "I reckon you stepped in it now, son," Cedric said. "You've been gone from Earth for a long time, Mr. Cassidy," Ember said stiffly. "There's been considerable change since then." "Doesn't mean it's good change?" Cedric's eyes narrowed. "Constable, I'll thank you to speak to my wife with the same respect you speak to me. Are we clear?" Cedric's teeth grew sharper, his hair shaggier. Cassidy swallowed hard. "Understood, Sheriff," Cassidy said. "I meant no offense." Cassidy cleared his throat. Anyway, what did Romulus have to say?" Ember relaxed, deciding to let go of her anger for the moment. Romulus claims the sword used to murder D.B. Cooper was stolen from his camp several days ago. Unfortunately, we have no way at present to prove or disprove his claim. We should speak to Mayor Earhart and ask her about what Romulus said. Cedric glanced back toward the butte. Just to get it out in the open, if nothing else. Constable Cassidy cleared his throat, shifting from foot to foot. That's a conversation I don't look forward to. Why not? Ember asked. 2 reasons, Cassidy said, unable to meet her gaze. 1, asking a woman about her past love life isn't exactly something a man from my generation is comfortable doing. 2. Ember cocked her eyebrow at him as he lapsed into silence. 2? Cassidy heaved a heavy sigh and stared up at City Hall. 2, well, let's just say Coop's not the only one who has a past history to dredge up. Ember rolled her eyes. Oh, for heaven's sake, fine, I'll bring it up. She walked ahead of the 2 men as they entered City Hall. Feeling too impatient for the elevator, she took the stairs instead, winding her way up to Earhart's office. Mayor Earhart greeted them with surprise. I wasn't expecting you to return so soon. How was your chat with Emperor Romulus? Ember felt her stomach doing flip-flops. She decided to start with the soft open. Emperor Romulus claims that the sword used to murder D.B. Cooper was stolen from his camp several nights ago. Mayor Earhart chuckled. That's awfully convenient. And of course, he didn't see fit to inform anyone of its theft? He claims he doesn't trust Driftwooders, Cedric said. Besides, I could see where admitting to the theft might make him look weak in the eyes of his followers. The room lapsed into silence. Cassidy stood at the window, looking out over the lightning flashing over the sandy plain. Mayor Earhart looked from Ember to Cedric and furrowed her brow. Was that all Romulus had to say? She asked at length. No, Ember said, tamping down her anxiety. Emperor Romulus pointed the finger at a different suspect. To be expected, who is he accusing? Ember took a deep breath and let it out slowly before she answered. You, Madam Mayor. He says that you might have killed Cooper because you were once involved. Mayor Earhart stood up and turned her back on them, leaning one hand against her office wall. It was a mistake, she said. He seemed to know a lot about airplanes and flying. Look, I didn't know how much of a jerk he was at the time, all right? So there was a relationship? Cedric asked. Yes, but that doesn't mean I killed him. Earhart's eyes darted over to Cassidy. I don't deny the affair, but Coop and I went our separate ways a long time ago. Thank you for your time, Ember said, nodding toward Mayor Earhart. The trio left her office, feeling somehow less enlightened than before. Chapter 8. Cassidy heaved a sigh of relief as they exited City Hall. He glanced over his shoulder even as he spoke. That went a lot easier than I thought it would. Thanks for breaking it to her, partner. No problem, Constable, Ember replied. In an investigation, you can't be biased, but personally, I don't feel Mayor Earhart is the responsible party. Yeah, reckon I don't either. Had to be laid out as a possibility to her, though, and I'm glad you handled it. Any time, Ember replied. How do you think we should handle questioning Hoffa and Magnano? Cassidy blanched, tugging at his collar. I'm not certain I can come along on that particular excursion. Why not? Ash asked, putting her hands on her hips. Are you the constable around these parts or not? I'm the constable, all right, but I also owe Hoffa a bottle of whiskey or two. Cedric chuckled. Figures, so pay him back. I can't afford it. Ember cocked an eyebrow. Wait a moment, constable. Just how many bottles of whiskey are we talking about here? Cassidy looked off into the distance. 3 dozen. 3 dozen? Ember sighed, running a hand down her face. Great. One of our chief suspects has the local law enforcement in his debt. I'm not liking how this case is going. It is what it is. Ash shrugged. All right, Cassidy. You go do lawman stuff or whatever. We'll go talk to the big, scary Jimmy Hoffa. Well, reckon you don't have to go and be all insulting about it, ma'am, Cassidy stammered, turning red. Ash cocked an eyebrow and matched his glare. 3 dozen. Your point is invalid. Cassidy sighed, dropped his gaze, and nodded. Can you at least point us in the direction of Hoffa's place of residence? Ember asked. Cassidy brightened up. I reckon I can. He lives over his casino, the Gold Star. You remember seeing the glass dome? Ember nodded. That's the one. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to confer with Captain Yang about the recent dragon incursions. Ember, Cedric, and Ash took their leave of the constable and headed for the dome. Ember spotted it easily. She wondered what vessel or structure it had been before. Was that dome some kind of ship? Ash asked, echoing her own thoughts. I was wondering the same thing, Cedric said. Remember the botanical gardens back home? I'm thinking it looks like a greenhouse or biosphere. Now it's a casino. I wonder what they use for money around here. Ash looked around. It seems like it's barter system. Food and water are provided to all, as well as electricity. Anything else you have to barter. Ember frowned. It looks like mostly prospectors frequenting the casino. Probably they gamble their scavenged loot. The dome loomed overhead, framed by jagged flashes of lightning. A pair of pinstripe suit-wearing goons flanked the entrance. One of them stepped forward and pointed at Cedric's service pistol. No weapons inside the casino, sir, he said politely. I can check it for you, if you like. Certainly, Cedric said, handing his gun over. Now, if you'll excuse me? Not so fast. Only players get to enter the casino. Do you intend to play? Cedric sighed. Yes, I intend to play. Then what are you going to exchange for chips? Cedric pursed his lips. Chips? Ember stepped forward and tapped Cedric's belt. What about his radio? That'll get us some chips, right? The goon nodded. Yes, it will. Proceed to the exchange office and be sure to have a good time. Friendly staff, Ash said as they moved into the casino. You think April is all right? She was napping pretty hard when we left her in the kids' care. I imagine, as long as he feeds her, things will be fine. Ember sighed. Unfortunately, April's used to being switched around to different caregivers a lot. Ash cocked an eyebrow. What if Munkalak shows his face? Ember groaned. Let's hope he doesn't. I can't solve everything at once, you know. Ash held her hands up. Sorry. They entered the darkened casino. Ember found it hard scrabble and pathetic compared to the casinos back home. There were only 2 slot machines, each of which had a line queue. A half-dozen tables featured blackjack, roulette, and other casino favorites. As Ember had expected, most of the patrons were prospectors. Cedric eschewed the exchange center and instead made a beeline for the management office. He rapped on the door and tried the knob. Hello? Anyone home? Is it locked? Ember asked. I think so, Cedric replied. Is there anyone inside? Cedric's nostrils flared, his eyes fluttering closed. He tested the air for scents, then nodded. There's definitely someone in there, he said. Smells like Hoffa, a few others I don't recognize, and the distillery workers. Knock again, maybe they didn't hear you over the noise from the casino, Ash said. Cedric rapped politely again. They stood for several seconds, waiting for a response which did not come. For a cop, you have a really polite knock. Ash sighed in exasperation as she strode forward. Here, allow me. This is how you get someone's attention at a party. Ash slammed her palm flat against the door and pounded a rapid tattoo. Ember winced at the sharp sound it created. That was rude, Ember said. Yeah, but it got their attention, Ash replied. I can hear someone coming toward the door. We'll have our audience with Jimmy Hoffa in a jiffy. The door flew open and a gun pressed between Ash's eyes. Who's the dead man banging on my door? Jimmy Hoffa snapped. Chapter 9. Ember felt the swell of magic flowing through her as she prepared a defensive spell to protect Ash. Cedric's hand grasped for the gun he no longer had, while Ash herself remained stock still. Hold up, is that a skirt? Hoffa clumped his way to the office entrance and glowered at Ash. Dilbert, get your stinking gun out of her face. We don't treat ladies like that here. This is a classy joint. Ash tried to hide her trembling as Dilbert put his gun away. He adjusted his disheveled tie and sneered through his round-rimmed glasses. What are you doing here? I thought you were talking to that Romulus cat who thinks he's emperor of the world. Ember stepped through the threshold. We did speak with Romulus, Mr. Hoffa, and Mayor Earhart as well. Now we would like to palaver with you. Hoffa scoffed. He retreated behind a wide, scuffed wooden desk and plopped down in a rolling office chair. Oh, so I'm a suspect now. He extracted a cigar from his desk drawer and lit it with a match. Ember cocked an eyebrow. A cigar and sulfur-tipped match. Those can't be easy to come by in Driftwood. Hoffa shrugged his rounded shoulders. I'm just a simple man trying to make his way in a world he never made, Toots. You got a point? It's come to our attention that you would have a lot to gain by the death of your partner, D.B. Cooper, as in gaining control of his third of your moonshining operation. Hoffa sneered. Look around you. Does it seem like I'm hurting here? I've got everything I want right here at my fingertips. Cedric stepped forward. You have to admit, it's awful suspicious. You were among the last people to see Mr. Cooper alive, were you not? Hoffa puffed on his cigar, the ember lighting up and giving his face a sinister amber cast. I'm not the one who got into a scuffle with Coop this afternoon now, am I? That would be these two skirts right here. Been in Driftwood less than a day and already screwing things up. Ember opened her mouth to rebuke Hoffa's sexist diatribe, but Cedric beat her to the punch. First of all, Mr. Hoffa, one of those skirts is my wife and the other my sister-in-law, so I'll thank you to speak to them with the utmost respect. Second, answer the question. Are you a wealthier man because of Cooper's demise, or are you not? Hoffa's teeth clamped on the end of his cigar. His eyes pierced Cedric with the promise of malice. He rose slowly from his seat, hands spread out on his desk. Who are you, boy, to stand up on your hind legs and sass me? Hoffa's hands curled into fists. He smashed them down upon the desk. Don't you know who I am? I run this town. You're nobody. Hoffa jabbed a finger at Ember. Now take your floozy and get to stepping on out of here. In less than a heartbeat, Cedric shifted into his hybrid form. Even though she knew the shaggy, hunched, gigantic creature was her husband, Ember repressed a shudder. Cedric's seldom-used hybrid form appeared as something out of a nightmare, a mix of human and lupine characteristics. Dilbert fainted dead away. Hoffa's mouth gaped open, the cigar tumbling from his mouth to fall on the desk. It rolled about, leaving a trail of ash behind it. Treat my wife with respect, Cedric growled in a barely intelligible, inhuman voice. Cedric returned to his human guise. Hoffa smiled, trying to pretend he wasn't terrified, though Ember noted the sheen of sweat on his balding forehead. Neat trick, Hoffa said, recovering his cigar. How you pull that off? Mirrors and such? It's not a trick, Cedric said, crossing his arms over his chest. And you never answered my question. Are you a richer man because of D.B. Cooper's death, or are you not? Hoffa chuckled softly, spreading his hands out wide. I got one half of his interests, yes. So, it just means my workload doubled. Besides, there's something you're not considering, my magician friend. Cedric's eyes narrowed. And what might that be? Hoffa leaned back in his chair, the portrait of self-control and unaffected snobbery. He puffed on the cigar, enjoying the way he held them in suspense. If I had wanted Coop dead, for whatever reason, Hoffa began in a low, cold tone, you wouldn't have found the body, and give me a little credit for Christ's sake. I would never be so dumb as to leave the murder weapon at the scene of the crime. Men like you don't get your hands dirty, Cedric growled. You work through proxies. Oh, I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty when I need to, boy, Hoffa said with a sneer. Best not test me. He crushed out the cigar and tried to rise from his chair. Hoffa's face crossed with a flash of anguish before he settled down into his chair again. Coolly, he dug in his desk drawer for a small metal tin. I've been here in Driftwood for a long, long time, my good sir and ladies. Ember noted he was at least paying them respect as Cedric had commanded. I've got more stroke than you might think. The mayor's more of a figurehead. I'm the one running the show. Hoffa opened the metal box and took a toothpick out of it. He tucked it in his cheek and rose carefully from his seat, bracing himself with hands on the desk. Now, kindly leave my establishment. Don't come back unless you want to gamble, here? Ember smirked. Certainly. Let's go, Cedric. She took his hand and tugged him away. The three of them exited Hoffa's office and headed toward the casino's exit. Well, he's either stonewalling us like a pro or he really didn't have anything to do with it, Cedric said. We'll add him to the suspects list, Ember replied. I'd like to speak with Mayor Earhart again. There might be a... Her voice trailed off as they walked out into the lane to find themselves surrounded by townsfolk, many of them armed. Romulus appeared above the crowd, borne aloft on a palanquin. There they are, he cried. Seize the murderers and execute them in the name of justice. Chapter 10. Emerald skyfire lit up Driftwood brighter than a noonday sun as the mob closed in on Ember and her group. Samurai rubbed shoulders with Victorian aristocrats as they called for her blood. What's going on? Ash's head was on a swivel, her gaze continuously darting about in search of the greatest threat. They were a bunch of jerks before, but not Lynchy. I think he happened, Ember growled, glaring daggers at Emperor Romulus. Romulus noticed her glare and met it with a grin. He spoke to the men carrying his palanquin and they set it upon the ground. Another soldier stepped up with a wooden stepladder. He unfolded it, and Romulus stepped upon it with a practiced air of unaffected nobility. My fellow refugees in this cursed land, he said, voice booming with the energy and verve of a practiced orator. If there's one thing we have learned, it is that we must work together for the common good. We take care of one another. His smile seemed at once fatherly and restrained. Its warmth was blinding, yet not enough, leaving the observer hungry for more. Ember shook her head, fighting off his magnetic spell. Is this guy using magic? Ash asked, brow furrowed. I don't think so, Ember replied. Just a really smooth talker, Cedric said with a snort. Ember cocked an eyebrow at him. Cedric seemed more rugged than normal. True, he didn't have access to his razor and couldn't shave, but his generally shaggy appearance caused her some concern. I'd like to pin him down and sink my teeth into his... Whoa, settle down there. Ash eyed Cedric up and down. What's gotten into you? First you went all wolfy on Jimmy Hoffa, now you're talking about savaging people. Ember frowned up at her amnesiac husband. I think it's the energy of this place. Shifters draw on the same ley line power we witches do. They just use it for a different purpose. Cedric relaxed with visible effort. That explains a lot. I've been on edge ever since we got here. Well, control yourself, Kaylee said, arching her back up at the encroaching crowd as Romulus continued speaking. We don't want to fight right now. We're badly outnumbered. Romulus pointed at Ember personally. Behold, my fellow refugees, a foul trickster from beyond the portal, a future woman who knows only greed and malice. She laid low our fellow citizen, and for what? A simple misunderstanding? Do we stand for this? Simple misunderstanding? Ash's face turned a crimson hue. Are you kidding me? D.B. Cooper tried to shake us down. Don't speak ill of the dead, shouted a nearby mustachioed man holding a pitchfork. Ash, maybe you should calm down too, Ember whispered. I should calm down? Ash turned an incredulous gaze her way. I'm sorry. Did you say something, Mrs. I almost used dark magic? Cedric gaped at Ember. You almost used dark magic? Can we not talk about this now? Ember's eyes darted about as Romulus reached a crescendo. We need to figure a way out of here. Mayor Earhart, Romulus began. The crowd took up a chorus of boos, causing Romulus to grin. Has declared that we must suffer the presence of murderers in our midst. My fellow citizens, Is this something any of you can stomach? That jerk, Ash grumbled. He's using us for political gain. Or trying to deflect attention away from himself if he killed Cooper, Cedric added. Could be both. Ember summoned up a spell to mind that would whisk the three of them away on a whirlwind. Ash's comment about dark magic gave Ember pause about casting it, however. What should we do? Cedric asked. These people are out for blood, and with Romulus whipping them up, it's only a matter of time before they get violent. Ember glanced at the casino and sighed. Any port in a storm, I guess, she muttered. What was that? Ember sighed. When I give the signal, close your eyes and keep them shut. When I say it's okay, run back into the casino. The casino? But Hoffa hates our guts. These people hate our guts and they want to kill us. At least Hoffa is only one of those so far. We don't have much choice, Cedric said. A rock flew through the air, passing harmlessly a foot above them. The errantly fired missile slammed into the concrete wall with a hard clack. Ember, whatever you're going to do it soon. Right. Ember took a deep breath and focused on drawing energy from the abundant ley lines. Close your eyes. Ash and Cedric obeyed. Kaylee kept her eyes open to assist Ember with the spell. What do you want to use? Spiders? No, Ember said. Cockroaches. That's sadistic, not to mention gross. Let's do snakes. It's so cliché. It's cliché because it works. Ember ducked under a rotten bit of purple vegetation. Snakes it is. She wove the spell, creating an illusion large enough to encompass everyone on the street. Serpents, hundreds of them, spilled out of every crevice. Hissing cobras, their hoods flared outward, mingled with noisy rattlesnakes. The mob retreated backward, clearing a path for them to flee. Run now! Ember dismissed the illusion, since she didn't want people to trample each other fleeing phantom snakes. They dashed into the casino and ran into Hoffa and his men. Sounds like Romulus outplayed you, Hoffa said, puffing on his cigar. Clearly he's the real killer. Maybe he is, Ember sighed. I hate to ask you a favor, Mr. Hoffa, but... say no more. Hoffa gestured to his right. Two of his goons took down a large portrait of Elvis to reveal a hidden door. This tunnel will take you safely out of town. If I were you, I wouldn't come back. Ember frowned. But we have to clear our name. The crowd outside grew louder again. Without the illusionary snakes to keep them at bay, the mob had regained its moxie. It's now or never, Hoffa said. Ember glowered. I guess we don't have a choice. Hoffa's men opened the secret door. Ember stared at the dark abyss and then plunged inside. Chapter 11. Ember cast a minor cantrip, causing a globe of light to appear in the palm of her hand. The tunnel walls resolved into rough-hewn stonework, many of the hammer marks still evident as streaks of paler rock. Cedric and Ash came behind, while Kaylee leaped off Ember's shoulder. I see a lot better in the dark than you do. I'll scout ahead. All right, but be careful. If the tunnel branches, just wait for us at the junction. I will. Kaylee padded silently into the gloom ahead. The darkness deepened when Hoffa's men shut the door behind them. They were sealed into the dark like a crypt. Ember repressed a shudder as the path took them down a gentle decline. She tried not to think how tons of rock hung overhead, hemming her in. What about April? Cedric asked. She's better off with the townsfolk than us for now, Ember said. When we figure out what we're doing, we'll go back for her. I feel so bad for her, Ash said. Ember sighed. Me too, but much as I hate to admit it, she'll have Munkalock to help keep her out of danger. They continued on, Ember struggling to ignore the oppressive weight of the ceiling crushing down on her. Ember, slow down, please, Cedric cried as she vaulted ahead with rapid, stiff-legged strides. The footing's uneven. She's claustrophobic, you big ape, Ash growled. This is like torture for Ember. I didn't know you were claustrophobic, Cedric said. I guess I lost my memory of that too. Ember slowed to a halt and turned about to face him. The globe in her hand glowed brighter as she spoke. So, actually, you didn't know that before you lost your memories either. You didn't ask then, and you didn't ask now. Well, Cedric frowned. Ease off of him, sis, Ash said. No, she's right. Cedric shook his head. I said a while back I wanted to get to know the woman I don't remember marrying. I haven't exactly stuck to my word. Well, can we talk about this later? Ember glanced about in the darkness behind them. I'm not claustrophobic, but it still creeps me out. Ember turned around and continued onward. She came upon Kaylee at a fork in the tunnels. See anything down here yet besides us? Kaylee's tail twitched. Not as of yet. I smell some kind of animal. Probably this dimension's version of a rodent. Ember sighed, putting her hands on her hips as she regarded the fork in the tunnels. Great. Did any of you hear Hoffa mention which way we were supposed to go? He didn't say a word about any such thing, Cedric said with a frown. Maybe he was hoping we'd get lost down here. Lost where he hides his hooch? No, that doesn't make sense. Ember shook her head. He'd be afraid we would drink up all his product. Probably the jerk just didn't think about it. Cedric stepped up to both tunnels, his nostrils flaring. He gestured at the branch which led off to their relative right. I smell fresh air down this path, and what I think is water. Then this is the way we go, Ember said. Not so fast. Cedric jerked his chin toward the right tunnel. I smell more than just that. There's a scent of those rodents Kaylee mentioned, and something else. Something bigger. Ember pursed her lips. That's a risk we'll have to take. Fine, Cedric said, but I'm going first. Cedric, wait! Ember called, but it was too late. Cedric already plunged into the tunnel. She whispered a single word to the globe in her hand. Follow. She blew the orb of green luminescence off her palm. It shot out like a crazy balloon, pursuing Cedric. Ember took off after them, following the dwindling sphere of magic. Cedric's footfalls echoed ahead of her. Ember plunged headlong, bringing to mind a protection spell just in case. The tunnel flared out into a wider cavern, the ceiling retreating upward. Ember saw wooden barrels of mismatched sizes, shapes, and materials. A small, razor-thin, lizard-like creature raced into the shadowed space between two barrels, its large eyes staring up at them. It's so cute, Ash squealed. It might be venomous, Ember said, cocking her brow. Don't try to pet it. Ash looked about. Where's Cedric? To Ember's relief, the cavern only had one other exit. She followed it, sensing the tug connecting her to the magical globe of light pursuing Cedric. Cedric? She called. I'm here, his voice came back. I found the exit. Ember came around a tight bend in the tunnel, and the blood-red sky appeared through a fissure in the rock. She struggled up a small incline, Ash on her heels. They turned sideways and squeezed through the narrow exit, their eyes wide as they beheld a crawling red sea. The waves lapped gently at the shore, breaking into pink foam as they washed over aquamarine sand. Shells of various shapes and colors littered the beach, some familiar, others exotic and alien. How big do you think this body of water is? Cedric stroked his chin as he gazed out over the crimson sea. Big enough we can't swim it, that's for sure, Ash said in dismay. Ember turned toward her sister. Ash stood with her shoes just beyond the edge of wet sand, holding a thin crystal rod, roughly the size of a pencil, toward the water. Why would we care about that, Ash? Ember asked. Because of what my rod is telling me. Ash turned to face her with eyes set hard. We're going to have to cross this sea if we want Cedric's memories back. Chapter 12. Ember settled down into the sand, finding its texture similar to more conventional beaches in her own dimension despite the exotic color. She settled in and looked at the crawling sea as it gently lapped the sandy shore. What are you doing? Ash asked. Taking a rest, Ember replied, laying back with her head held in her cupped hands. It's a long walk back to Driftwood. You're getting sand in your hair, and why on earth would we want to go back to Driftwood? Cedric chuckled and settled into a seat beside Ember on the sand. Don't mind me. I'll let the witches figure this one out. I can use a cantrip to clean my hair, Ash. And how else are we going to get across this ocean unless we go back to Driftwood and borrow a boat? Ash cocked an eyebrow. You know a hair-cleaning cantrip and you never taught it to me? Never mind. Surely there's a spell we can use to get across the water. Ash sat down beside Ember, though she bounced with eager energy. There's lots of spells we can use to cross it. Name one, Ember replied. What about a spell of water walking? Ash clapped her hands smartly together. That's it. It lasts for hours, days if you want it to. It doesn't take much energy, and we can cast it on Cedric too. Yes, but take a look at those waves. Water walking suspends us on the surface, which is great for a placid river or pond. Not so great when the floor will be rocking and rolling under our feet the entire time, so to speak. Oh, drat, Ash sighed. I hadn't considered that. Cedric cleared his throat. Pardon me, I'm no magic expert, but can't you use a spell to summon a boat or something? Ember pursed her lips. I do know a spell to create a boat, but it requires something to work with. Wood being ideal. It doesn't summon so much as shape. So shape a boat out of sand, Ash suggested. That wouldn't be buoyant. Ember stared up at the blood-red sky as another flash of lightning lit up the air. What else do you got? Well, Ash lapsed into silence for a time. They laid there in a line on the sand, watching the stormy skies and listening to the rolling waves. Ash sat up, her eyes eager and alight. I've got it. We'll use a summon spell to call a whale, and it can carry us on its back. Summon an earth whale in this dimension. Ember gestured out at the water. I'd hate to see what showed up to answer the summons. No, face it, Ash. We have to go back to town, clear our names, and ask them for assistance getting across the sea. What if they don't have a boat? Cedric asked. Then maybe someone knows an overland route to where we're going, Ember replied. We can't go it alone in this dimension. We don't have the resources. What if we flew over on brooms? Ash asked, a desperate note creeping into her tone. Ember shook her head. I don't know about you, but my broom is back in our dimension. Could you two get new ones somehow? Cedric asked. Ember's brow furrowed. Maybe. I haven't seen much wood around, but I'm sure we could figure something out. The problem is, it takes a while to attune to a new broom, and the actual creation process can take up to a week in and of itself. I never knew it was so involved, Cedric said. Oh yes, Ember said. First and foremost, you need a strong flight spell permanently affixed to the broom itself. Next, you want to increase the sturdiness with another enchantment. And of course, you want the usual comfort cantrips to prevent chafing and muscle fatigue. Not to mention the shield spell so you can breathe at high speeds, Ash interjected. Yes, you can't forget those. Then you want a familiar pocket on the bristles, so your familiar doesn't fly off during a loop-the-loop. So yes, it's complicated, Cedric. It takes a lot of effort to make a broom a functional flying conveyance. Why not make something more comfortable fly, like a motorcycle? Cedric asked. The spell only works on matter that is or once was living, so no motorcycles. Why stick to the broom format? Cedric asked. You could shape it into a chair or something, make it more comfortable. Then you wouldn't need the extra enchantments. Ash chuckled. That's not a bad idea, Cedric. The added weight of a chair would mean you couldn't fly as fast, nor would you be as maneuverable, but sure, I guess it would be possible. Typical man, Ash quipped. Too lazy to ride on a broom like a witch. Cedric and Ember laughed, a gleeful sound in counterbalance to the rhythmic, somber tides. Ember sat up and stretched, gazing at the crimson sea. Well, one thing's for sure. We won't get any closer to our goals by lazing around on the beach like we're on vacation. Back to Driftwood? Ash asked. Ember nodded. I wish there were an alternative. Hopefully by now, Mayor Earhart has restored some semblance of order. We should be cautious all the same. We need to at least collect April, Cedric said firmly. Right. We might have to bug out of here back to Earth at any time. Ash frowned. I don't know, sis. It's a one-time deal. We can cross over and go back home once, but after that, the walls between our dimension and this one have grown thicker. That's why we're the first newcomers in such a long time. So we get Cedric's memories this time or we lose our chance forever, Ember grumbled. No pressure. Chapter 13. Ember stared up at the towering sheer cliffs before them. The jagged facade offered precious little purchase. Cedric shook his head and grunted. Nothing for it. We have to go back through the tunnel. I'd rather not, just in case the mob got the bright idea to follow us. Would Jimmy Hoffa sell us out? Ash asked. Ember shrugged. I wouldn't bet the family farm on it. Still, I'd rather find another way up. I don't see how. Cedric gestured around. We're in a cove of sorts, with the cliffs forming a natural barrier on all sides that aren't pink foamy sea. Ash turned to Ember. So we asked the rocks to make a stairway for us. Ember pursed her lips, considering the cliff face with a skeptical eye. That's a lot of mass to transmute, Ash. With how much energy this dimension has to spare, it shouldn't be a problem. Yes, but it will wear us out too. Then we won't have anything left in the tank if we run into more trouble. Kaylee twitched her tail in annoyance. Aren't you two forgetting something? What's that? Ash asked. Solid rock's not the only material we have to work with. Kaylee leaped off Ember's shoulder and pawed around on the beach. Sand will make a staircase too, and it's a lot easier to deal with than stone. Ember chuckled and scratched behind Kaylee's ears. Kaylee, you're a genius. Why is sand easier than stone? Cedric asked. A lot of sand's composition is made up of fragments of seashells or even whole very tiny shells. Ember gestured at the ocean. In other words, it was once living, and therefore more susceptible to magic seduction. I'm learning a lot about magic this trip, Cedric chuckled. Can you do it? Ash looked at Ember and nodded. I think we can, and it won't exhaust us to boot. Ember and Ash joined hands. They chanted together softly, shaping the magic pouring through their bodies into the sand. First, a tiny furrow appeared on the beach, nudging up toward the bloody skies. Then it expanded, resolving itself into a spiral staircase shape. Cedric gaped as the staircase wound itself from the beach, twisting in the air. Ember and Ash ceased their chanting and stood back to admire their handiwork. Not bad, Ember said. Not bad? Look at it, it's beautiful. Ash sighed. How long does it last? Cedric asked. Ember chuckled. My husband, ever the practical one. We're looking at half an hour tops. Sand yields to magic easier than stone, but it also doesn't hold its shape nearly as well. Ember led the way, stepping onto the sandy staircase. The spiral design made for tight turns and a cramped and narrow path to the top. Cedric had to struggle to keep from bumping his head or falling out the side. You could have made a safety rail, he panted as they neared the top. It's better than the sand staircase you magicked up, Ember snapped. But I didn't. Okay, I get it. Shutting up now. Ash laughed. If I didn't know better, I'd say Cedric had his memories back already. It's nice to hear you two bantering again. Ember glanced back at Cedric. His blue eyes swam with an intense, raw desire for a long moment before he literally shook it off. We should keep going, he said. Right, Ember replied. She didn't want to alarm anyone, but the sand seemed less firm than it had a few moments ago. Still, she filed that intense gaze away in her memory for safekeeping. It had been a long time since her amnesiac husband had stared at her in such a way. Ember made it to the top of the staircase. She scowled as her feet sank into the surface a few inches. Motioning frantically for Cedric and Ash, she formed a conduit through her body between the ley lines and the collapsing sand stairwell. Hurry, she said. It won't hold for much longer. Cedric frowned, pausing at the 2-foot gap between stairwell and cliff top. You go first. I'm the only thing holding this construct together, Cedric, Ember hissed through gritted teeth. Get going now. You're blocking Ash down below. Cedric pumped his long legs, leaping across the span in one prodigal hop. Ash raced past, flashing Ember a worried glance before leaping to the other side. Cedric helped her land and turned back to Ember. Quick, grab my hand, he cried, stretching out his arm. Ember found herself in a predicament. It took all her concentration to hold the staircase together. If she dropped that concentration to leap out for his hand, she would find herself plummeting toward the beach below. Yet she couldn't continue channeling magic through her body. The temptation to use dark magic to insulate herself came and went. Ember had a better idea. She channeled the energy not to hold the sand structure together, but to fuse it together with eldritch heat. The sand shimmered into milky, surreal glass. Ember felt the stairwell crackling under her weight. She dashed toward the cliffside as the construct shattered below near the beach. Jump! Cedric bellowed. She leaped toward the gap as the stairwell fell backward toward the sea. Her hand closed on Cedric's own. He tugged hard, using her momentum to drag her fully across. A great cacophony of tinkling glass filled the air as the stairwell splintered and crackled. Ember found herself laying on top of Cedric. Her hands rested on his chiseled pecs, his heart thudding hard under her right palm. Wow, forgot how hard these were, she said with a chuckle. Ember reluctantly dragged herself off of Cedric. She and Ash helped him to his feet, and they stared back at the beach they'd vacated. Too bad about your staircase, Cedric said. It lasted as long as it needed to. Ember shrugged. That's all that matters. You guys? Ash grabbed Ember's arm. Do you hear that? Ember froze. The unmistakable sound of combustion engines approached. Would they turn out to be friends? Or foes? Chapter 14. Cedric reached for his pistol, but Ember placed a hand on top of his own. Wait, they might not be hostile. That's got to be the sound of someone from Driftwood, Cedric said. Possibly somebody armed. Ember sighed. I know, but I think I recognize those engines as belonging to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance kid. If they show up and we have weapons drawn, it sends the wrong message. Cedric let his hand drop to his side. All right, darlin', we'll do it your way. Ember cocked an eyebrow. Darling? It just slipped out, Cedric said, his face turning red. Hey, I think it is those two. Ember looked out over the craggy plain to see the approaching cyclists. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance kid rode toward them, the city of Driftwood in the distance behind them. She couldn't tell from their stoic expressions whether they had hostile intentions or not. Ember decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. Several protective spells sprang into her mind just in case the two men meant to cause mischief. Cassidy parked his bike first, the engine still popping as he marched across the hardscrabble terrain toward them. I'm glad to see y'all are safe. So you're not here to arrest us? Ember asked. Of course not. Mob action is not the rule of law. He flicked the star pinned to his chest and Cedric frowned. We managed to get things calmed down in Driftwood for the time being. It should be safe to return. So we can clear our name? Ash asked. We know who likely did it. It was Romulus, Cedric replied. Or someone working for him. Cassidy's lips twitched a smile under his mustache. That's what we thought too, but an eyewitness has come forward. An eyewitness? Ember asked. Yes. Dr. Oscar Acosta was seen prowling around near the distillery, with a sword in his hand by a credible eyewitness. Cedric stepped forward. Dr. Acosta? Oscar Zeta Acosta? Yes, I believe that's his full Christian name. You know him? Cedric arched an eyebrow, only by reputation. Ember turned to Cedric. How do you know this man? Cedric chuckled. When you're the sheriff of a sleepy county like mine, you have a lot of free time on your hands at the station. I used to read a lot of Hunter S. Thompson, like many others in law enforcement. Oscar Acosta was a close friend of his, if a little bit, eccentric. Eccentric? Ember cocked an eyebrow. Do you think he's dangerous? Cassidy shrugged. He's a strange guy, no doubt. Usually, he's only dangerous to himself. I could see him doing the deed, though, if he were far enough in outer space on that particular occasion. "Butch," Sundance Kid called, still astride his motorcycle. "We ought to head back before Romulus riles folks up again. We can give the womenfolk rides if your, wolf friend here can fend for himself." Cedric grinned. "With pleasure." Ember grasped Cassidy's arm as they walked to his motorcycle, causing him to pause. "Say, what's that thing the Sundance Kid is always chewing on? A toothpick?" "It's a fishbone, actually. There's a species of fish that lives in the Red Sea that tastes awful, but produces enzymes which are helpful in fighting arthritis." "Arthritis? I didn't think people aged in Driftwood." "He's had a long career as a gunfighter before he ever came here. Trigger finger's been bothering him for years. The fishbone helps. Now come on, let's mount up and get you back to Driftwood. It's not safe out here." Cedric shifted into his wolf form and loped off toward the distant city. Ember and Ash climbed onto the motorcycles behind Butch and Sundance, and soon they rumbled along after. They struggled to overtake Cedric, who poured on additional speed to pull ahead once more. Ember scowled at her husband as he tore ahead so quickly. He left dust billowing in his wake. He grew more wolf-like every day, and she wasn't certain she liked it. All the more reason to conclude their business swiftly and return to their own dimension. When they reached the city limits, the men parked the bikes and the party continued on foot. Butch and Sundance provided an escort. While none of the townsfolk were openly hostile toward Ash and Ember, there were many dark mutterings and black looks. "Mr. Cassidy," Ember said, "who witnessed this Dr. Acosta on Cooper's property with a sword." "A dreary author named Ambrose Bierce," Cassidy replied. "Kind of a weirdo himself, but harmless." "And you believe this Ambrosa fellow?" Cedric asked. Cassidy shrugged. "He's got no reason to lie, and his home sits in a spot where he could easily see into Cooper's backyard." "I think we need to talk to this Dr. Acosta," Ember said. "That's where we're headed." Cassidy took them into City Hall, where Mayor Earhart favored them with a rueful, resigned sigh. "What's up?" Cassidy asked. "It's Dr. Acosta. He's resisting? He won't cooperate with the interrogation?" Cassidy cocked an eyebrow. "I know a way what might loosen his tongue. Or his teeth, whichever comes first." Earhart twitched a scowl. "Go and talk to him. You'll see." Ember, Ash, Cedric, and Cassidy entered a small windowless room where they found Dr. Acosta. He sat staring up at the flickering light overhead. "Dr. Acosta," Cassidy said politely, "we'd like to talk to you about your whereabouts on the day D.B. Cooper was murdered." "Why?" Acosta asked, his dark eyes fixed on the light. The man's heavy jowls trembled as he gaped at the flickering fluorescent bulb. "Because someone said you did it?" Ember prodded. "Did what?" "Killed D.B. Cooper," Ember sighed. "What we were just talking about." "Oh, that. Yeah, I killed him." Ember gaped. "You did? You admit it?" "You ever wonder why bugs go up on light fixtures to die? It's because they're not dying. They're transmogrifying into a purely energy state." Ember and Cedric exchanged glances. Mr. Acosta." "Dr. Acosta." "Sorry. Dr. Acosta, you're saying that you killed D.B. Cooper?" "Yes, I killed him." "You stabbed him in the back with a sword?" "No," he said, his gaze intense. "I used my ESP to cause a hemorrhage in his temporal lobe. I have psychic powers, you know." Ember and Cedric exchanged worried glances. Despite Acosta's confession, they both felt the same thing. They doubted the case was solved just yet. Chapter 15. "Please listen to us, Mayor Earhart." Ember followed the swiftly walking woman up the steps toward her office. "Just because Dr. Acosta confessed doesn't mean he's the killer." Earhart frowned, pausing in her advance. She turned about, one hand still resting on the rail. "Then why would he confess to it?" Ember struggled to keep her composure. She knew that in Amelia Earhart's time, the idea of false confessions seemed foreign. Ember didn't believe Oscar had killed D.B. Cooper, confession or no. "I'm not entirely certain Dr. Acosta is in his right mind," Ember said. Earhart chuckled. On that, we're in full agreement. Still, he has his moments of lucidity. If he should sober up at some point and recant his confession, I'll be all ears. Until then, we're keeping him locked up as our number one suspect. Cedric stepped up beside Ember on the stairway, his warm bulk a comfort. What will you do with him now? Will there be a trial? Earhart nodded, a pained grimace on her face. Yes, there will be a trial, which I must preside over. It will only be the 6th such trial since the settlement began. That's an astonishingly low murder rate, Ember said. Earhart sighed. That's a misleading statistic. In many cases, the killer never sees a trial because they are lynched by mob justice. Ember's heart sank into her feet. That's awful. Ash squeezed her way to the front of the ranks, staring up at Amelia Earhart with hopeful eyes. Madame Mayor? We have a problem which we could use your help with. Earhart chuckled. All right, I'll hear you out, but let's do it in my office. This stairwell is getting crowded. The party moved up to Earhart's tidy office. Ember sipped on tea while Ash explained their dilemma. So you see, Madam Mayor, we need a way to cross that Red Sea. Do you know of anyone who might help us? Earhart steepled her fingers in front of her face and sighed. You're talking about crossing the vast deep sea. No one from Driftwood has ever done so and came back to tell the tale. You mean no one's ever been to the other side? Ember asked, aghast. Earhart nodded. I'm afraid that's true. Some bold explorers and prospectors have made the attempt in cobbled-together vessels. None have ever returned to tell us what's on the other side. Ember's heart sank. That's terrible. Does anyone have any idea how wide it is? Or is there an overland route to the other side, maybe? Ash asked. Earhart pushed her chair back and drew out her centermost drawer. She withdrew a sheaf of rolled paper and spread it out on her desk, using a heavy gear paperweight to keep it unfurled. This is our known, mapped-out area of this dimension, Earhart said. It's so small, Cedric said. Have you really not explored more than this general area? Earhart shook her head. Many attempts have been made and many people died. The dragons and the storms are least severe in the area we settled Driftwood in. Survival is tantamount to curiosity. Ember thought for a long moment, clenching her hand into a fist. She then glanced up suddenly. Madam Mayor, what happened to your airplane? Did it come across to this dimension with you? The mayor flinched. The Electra? Why do you ask? Could you use it to fly us across the ocean? Even if I could find a fuel substitute, I wouldn't even want to try, Earhart said with a shake of her head. It's a fool's errand. Please, it might be our only way across. Ember leaned on Earhart's desk, her eyes wide and pleading. Mayor Earhart frowned thoughtfully as she regarded Ember. What's so important that you have to cross that ocean to get to it? Ember pursed her lips. You're used to this dimension and all of its weirdness. Are you open to the idea of more weirdness? Earhart cocked an eyebrow. Try me? Ember launched into her tale, holding back nothing. She named herself and Ash as witches, Cedric as a wolf shifter, and the exact nature of his amnesia. Earhart listened to the entire story with an inscrutable frown etched on her features. Well, Mayor Earhart said, clearing her throat, some stories are so unlikely they have to be true. Let me talk to some of my fellow aviators and see what shakes out. Ember gasped. Thank you so much. I'm not promising anything yet. I'm not sure we can even make the Electra fly at this point, but if it's at all possible, I'm willing and able. Cedric stroked his chin thoughtfully. What made you change your mind, Mayor? Mayor Earhart smiled at Ember. I figure it must really be awful to have your husband not remember who you are. Besides, I've longed for the sky for a very long time. You'd be helping me, in a way. I finally have an excuse to get back up there. Cedric laughed. Fair enough. How long do you need to determine if your plane can fly again? Mayor Earhart pursed her lips. 3 days maybe. In the meantime, I invite you to attend our Festival of Starflowers. It only happens once per year? Starflowers? Earhart chuckled. Not real flowers in the way we think of them. Tiny starfish, bioluminescent and capable of flight. They flit around, barely visible except as specks of light during their mating season. It happens tomorrow night. Sounds intriguing, Ember said. We'd love to stay and see it. Great. I'll get you set up in a temporary dwelling, and hopefully in a few days we'll be back in the sky. The way Mayor Earhart turned her bold gaze to the air gave Ember reason to hope. Come hell or high water, that woman was going to fly again. Chapter 16. Mayor Earhart provided an empty house made from a hollowed-out fishing trawler. Its cramped environs offered 2 bedrooms and a communal lavatory. Cooking was done outside, like most of Driftwood's denizens. Ember and Cedric got the larger of the 2 bedrooms, while April and Ash occupied the other. April's alter ego Munkalock caused some friction with Ash, but Ember's timely intervention prevented it from growing worse. As the Starflower Festival drew near, the denizens of Driftwood hung banners and decorations from their homes and businesses. Musicians plied their trade, warming up or offering street-side performances for whatever food or trinkets passers-by could spare. It didn't quite feel like Christmas, but the village of Driftwood took on a different aspect. Some people even nodded in Ember's direction, or grunted a crude hello. Most of the town accepted that Dr. Acosta had killed Cooper verbatim. It seemed she was the only one with doubts. Yet that only made her doubts plague her all the more. She felt the sting of unfinished business, a keen pain in her psyche. Solving mysteries was something she excelled at, and even craved. Worse, the knowledge that D.B. Cooper's real killer likely remained at large wouldn't allow her to rest. She couldn't abandon the people of Driftwood and return to her own life, knowing there was a killer on the loose. Looks like they're going all out, Cedric said from the grill, where he turned beatstock into slightly less repugnant fare. Holidays like this one can bind a community together, Ember replied. It doesn't matter what race, religion, or creed someone's from if you make it a nature celebration. Well, I'd be happy to celebrate a nice juicy steak, Cedric grumbled. I don't know how much longer I can go on eating this stuff. Not much longer, Ember said. Soon enough, Mayor Earhart will know whether she can make her plane fly again. Then we can fly across the sea and find your memories at last. Cedric took the beatstock off the grill and set it aside. He turned toward Ember and fixed her with a somber gaze. What's wrong? She asked. April, or maybe Munkalock, shrieked inside of their former boat home. Cedric winced, then gestured for Ember to approach. Take a walk with me? Ember cocked an eyebrow. A walk? Sure. He surprised her by taking her hand in his own. Cedric led her off down the main avenue, which wound its way through most of Driftwood at one point or another. His hand felt warm as it cupped her own. Townsfolk used strings of brightly colored seashell as decorations, winding them about support pillars and light poles. Ember stepped widely around a man whose string had broken, spilling his brightly colored shells to the ground. What did you want to talk about? Ember asked when Cedric's silence grew strained. I was thinking about our trip across the ocean, he said. What about it? Ember frowned up at his serious expression. It seems rather dangerous, doesn't it? He sighed. I'm not sure what kind of fuel they can come up with for Mayor Earhart's plane, but I'm betting it won't be unlimited or offer as much economy as the real thing. What are you getting at? Suddenly you're an airplane engineer? Ember withdrew her hand from his grasp. I'm trying to get your memories back, Cedric. Don't you care? Of course I care, Cedric said. It's just, what if the water's too wide for us to make it on a single tank of gas? We'll go until we've used just under half our fuel and then turn back. That way we can map out the dimensions of the ocean or sea, or whatever we want to call it. Cedric sighed. How long will that take? Days? Weeks? Years? Ember opened her mouth to retort, but it died on her tongue. Cedric tugged her off the busy avenue onto a side street and took her hands in his own. Ember, You have to accept the fact that we might not ever be able to get my memories back. Just because they're across that ocean doesn't mean they're just on the other side. How big is this dimension? Ash made out as if it might be 100 times larger than Earth. I don't know how big it is, I don't exactly have a map, Ember sputtered. Why are you so resistant to the idea of getting your memories back? I'm not resistant to getting my memories back, Cedric said quickly. I'm resistant to the idea of you getting hurt trying to get them back. Cedric's blue eyes grew tender. Ember. His hand swept along her cheek, gently caressing her skin. Ember sighed, leaning into his touch. I might not remember our first date or getting married, but I feel like we're supposed to be together. Ember snapped her gaze to meet his own, a gasp of astonished joy escaping from her lips. I don't need my memories to be with you. I don't even need them to... Ember laid her fingers across the back of his hand. Need them to what? I don't need memories to love you, he said softly. Cedric moved his face in closer. Ember raised her lips eagerly to accept the incoming kiss. A resounding thud echoed across the city, rattling windows and in some cases, shattering them. Ember stumbled into Cedric, and would have fallen if not for his strong arms. What was that? She gasped. I don't know, Cedric said, staring at a growing smoke cloud in the distance. But I think we better find out. Chapter 17. Cedric led the charge through the milling crowd gathered around the smoking crater in the dirt. D.B. Cooper's storage container simply wasn't there any longer. Twisted ribbons of metal snaked throughout the nearby landscape, and structures were the only sign it had ever existed in the first place. Ember staggered forward when the crowd surged behind her, nearly falling into the 5-foot-deep crater. Cedric's strong grip saved her from a headlong plunge. You all right? He asked. I'm fine. What do you think did this? Lightning strike? Cedric pursed his lips in thought. Maybe. This is an awful big explosion for just a still, unless this rock is more porous than it seems. I suppose that might be the case. Was anybody in here when it exploded? Ember directed her question toward one of the locals. Nobody's missing as far as I know, the dark-skinned man said with a shrug. If you ask me, Romulus finally made his move. I don't follow, Ember said with a frown. How does the still exploding equate to Romulus making his move? It's simple, newcomer. Alcohol offers people a respite from their problems, makes them less anxious. Anxious people are a lot easier to corral and control if you catch my drift. Ember considered the man's hairstyle and garments. Were you by any chance brought here from the 1960s? Why, yes, I was. How could you tell? Lucky guess. Ember worked her way over to Cedric and Cassidy. So far, nobody's missing. What do you think happened? Cassidy put his hands on his hips and shook his head as he regarded the crater. I think the darn still just exploded all on its own. It happens sometimes. I would agree with Constable Cassidy's assessment, Cedric said, except that it's awfully convenient that our crime scene, and any clues we might have missed, just went up in smoke. Make way for the mayor, called Sundance Kid as the crowd parted for Amelia Earhart. She stared at the crater and grimaced. Great, that's all we need, she grumbled. Has anyone seen Jimmy Hoffa or James Mangano? Who was tending this still? Jimmy Hoffa moved forward, flanked by 2 men with rifles. I'm here, Madame Mayor. I'll take full responsibility. He looked around at the gathered townsfolk. Not only that, but I promise that by the end of the week, I'll be producing spirits again for your consumption. The crowd offered their cheers, causing Earhart to grimace. Ember worked her way over to the mayor. What do you think happened? Did Hoffa blow up his own still just to compromise the evidence of his crime? I'm not much of one for speculation, she said. Or investigation, for that matter. Mrs. Ember, I get the feeling that you're a lot more suited for such matters than I am. What do you think happened? Ember pursed her lips. It could have been an accident. Very easily. She blew out a sigh as she regarded the blasted landscape. The only thing is, Cedric is right. If Hoffa were worried about trace evidence at the scene, then an explosion would be a great way to eradicate it. There's not much we can do for it except hope Dr. Acosta sobers up sometime soon and gives us a coherent statement. Earhart shook her head as she watched Hoffa work the crowd. He's milking this for everything it's worth. Of course he is. Ember gestured toward the Imperial Butte. It looks as if His Highness, Emperor Romulus, is about to grace us with his presence. The Imperial palanquin worked its way down the spiral ramp toward the blasted landscape below. Mayor Earhart chuckled bitterly. He's going to do the same thing as Hoffa, I expect. Be seen looking calm and collected during a crisis, so they can get me out of office next election. Well, he comes from a time and place where political machinations were considered part of the natural order. Ember shrugged. Ask the mountain not to be tall before you ask him not to try and take advantage. Mayor Earhart laughed softly. I guess you're right. You want to come with me while I talk to His Highness? Very well, Ember replied. She didn't much care for Romulus, but thought maybe Mayor Earhart could use the backup. They strode across the crumbing plain toward the Imperial entourage. How many followers does Romulus have? Ember asked. We're not sure. He takes great pains to hide their numbers from us, but I wager it's less than 100. You can't fit that many people up on that butte. Why would anyone give up their rights to follow an emperor? The modern people, I mean. There was an American who follows Romulus. Oh, Bob? Mayor Earhart chuckled. Who knows? A lot of people thought I was crazy for trying to be the first woman to make a transatlantic flight, too. Maybe I was. Ember shook her head. You're not crazy, Mayor. Your sanity is what grounds these people in Driftwood and keeps them working together. For now, Ember, Earhart said with a sigh. For now. She stopped, putting her hands on her hips as she shouted up at Romulus. What can I do for you, Romulus? If you can't tell, I've got a lot on my hands at the moment. I heard a sound akin to a volcano's roar, and wanted to investigate and offer what assistance I may. Mayor Earhart opened her mouth to argue, but Cassidy ran up to her side, shouting her name. Mayor Earhart, he gasped. Mayor, I've got bad news. What now? Mayor Earhart asked, her jaw clenched tightly. It's Dr. Acosta, Cassidy said. He's escaped. Chapter 18. The murderer has escaped justice? Emperor Romulus's face drew into a theatrical mask of utter horror. Oh, the damage such a knave might cause while running loose. Were I in charge of his custody, this Acosta fellow would remain safely incarcerated and be a burden to no one. Ember rolled her eyes. Thanks for that wonderful, eloquent, utterly useless monologue, Emperor Romulus. When you have something constructive to add, let us know. Romulus's face furrowed into a miffed scowl as Ember turned to Cassidy. Do you have any idea where Acosta may have fled? Guy like that? It's hard to tell. The good doctor is like chaos personified. His brows came low over his eyes. Besides, I thought you were convinced that Dr. Acosta wasn't the killer, in spite of his confession. Why are you concerned about his whereabouts? Ember cocked an eyebrow. For one thing, he's the best lead we have at the moment. For another, the real killer might very well take a shot at him, since dead men tell no tales, and he wouldn't be able to recant his confession when he sobered up. And three, he's a human being. He may have lost his way, but that just means we need to help him find his way back. Cedric laughed as Cassidy looked abashed. I should have warned you not to get on her bad side, Constable Cassidy. Mayor Earhart looked at Constable Cassidy. We need to recapture Dr. Acosta as soon as possible, for his own sake, even if he's not a killer. I'm on it, ma'am, Cassidy said, tipping his hat. I'll put together a posse. I'd like to be part of that posse, Mayor, Ember said. Me too, Cedric said. I'll go ask Ash if she can watch April for us. Going outside the city limits is dangerous business, Mayor Earhart said with a frown. You've seen the dragons and the lightning, but there are other things out there as well. Ember glanced at Romulus, who bravely declared he would be joining the search party setting out to find Dr. Acosta. Cedric returned, face drawn in thought. Ember, do you remember who the eyewitness was, who saw Dr. Acosta sneaking around D.B. Cooper's property with a sword? Ember's eyes widened. Oh, Ambrose Bierce? Yeah, him. Has anyone even followed up with him? Cedric shook his head. Sometimes when you go back to a witness a few days later, their entire story changes. Either they're lying or they remembered it wrong the first time. You get me? Couldn't hurt, Ember said. But you're not officially law enforcement here. How do we get him to talk to us? Cassidy piped up. I think I can help with that. Bierce thinks himself a real manly man. I bet I can talk him into joining the posse. Then you can work him on the sneak, you feel me? Cedric nodded. That's a great idea, Constable. Thank you. Cassidy grinned. Us lawmen have to stick together. He clapped Cedric on the shoulder and moved off. Ember cocked an eyebrow at her husband. Looks like you've made a friend. I wouldn't call it that yet, Cedric replied. He's still an outlaw. Not any longer? He's not. If he's so high and mighty, why is he in debt to a gangster like Jimmy Hoffa and his cronies? Now you're just being mean. Addiction can be a tough thing to break. Cedric's expression softened. You're right. I don't mean to sound heartless, Cassidy had to know that going into debt could potentially compromise him on a professional level. Yet he did it anyway. It's easy to make a mistake in the heat of the moment, Ember replied. We need to try and be the ones who find Dr. Acosta, Cedric. Literally anyone else might be the real killer. Some more likely than others, Cedric said, glaring at Emperor Romulus. Hopefully Mayor Earhart can spare some of Yang's brigade to escort us. I don't like the idea of Romulus having us outnumbered. Do you think he'd try something? Really? Ember scowled at the ancient ruler. It seems to me like he's making an underhanded but legitimate power grab, working within the confines of the political system Driftwood's citizens have set up for themselves. Cedric put his hands on his hips and shook his head as Emperor Romulus picked up a young child and balanced the boy on his hip. He's literally playing the kissing babies card, Cedric said. This guy. No use getting upset about it, Cedric. Ember looked at the useless radio at Cedric's belt. Want to go on a little excursion with me? We need supplies for our journey. Cedric followed her gaze down to his radio and shrugged. I guess it doesn't do me much good in this dimension. But the people of this one can break it down into useful components and materials, Ember said. And it will help us ask around just in case. Just in case what? Cedric asked. Ember's lips twitched a sneer. Just in case it turns out Ambrose Bierce, famed author of Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, is in debt to Jimmy Hoffa just like our good constable. Chapter 19. In the end, Ember and Cedric traded the radio for 2 canteens, a patchwork tent, and a retrofitted golf cart designed to run on the Dimension's viscous petrol approximate. They joined the posse at the north edge of town. Jagged lightning flashed across the skies above as the band milled about, mostly keeping to their own factions. The official Driftwood posse, as Ember thought of it, consisted of herself, Cedric, Cassidy, Ambrose Bierce, and 10 of Captain Yang's best men. Emperor Romulus himself brought along more than a dozen soldiers, as well as another handful of hangers on to attend to his every need. Some of his men rode double on cycles, though a number joined Romulus on his utility van turned into Imperial Howdah. Finally, there was what Ember considered to be Team Hoffa, a group of a dozen of his thugs, all armed with machine guns and riding in 3 separate dune buggies. Ember noted the displeasure written across Constable Cassidy's face as he regarded the Hoffa contingent. If they get half a chance, I figure they'll take a shot at Dr. Acosta, Cedric said. We need to keep an eye on them. Ember nodded. This Oscar Acosta person. What about him? It just strikes me as really sad that he was driven crazy by this dimension and turned to drugs to hide his pain. Cedric laughed heartily, causing Ember to frown in worry. What's so funny about what I said? Darlin', Dr. Acosta turned to drugs a long time before he was trapped in this dimension. It's kind of one of the hallmarks of his character. Ember rolled her eyes. Still, I don't want him to be killed, especially not so a murderer can go free. She gestured at Romulus's contingent. They could be a threat to Dr. Acosta as well, if Romulus himself had something to do with D.B. Cooper's death. You're not wrong. Cedric shook his head grimly. I haven't crossed Romulus off our suspects list just yet, and that's got nothing to do with the way he raised an angry mob to try and kill us all. Ember glanced over at Cedric. He'd purchased a wide-brimmed hat with the credit remaining from the police radio. It cast a shadow over his handsome, worried face. What's eating you? Ember asked. I mean, what else is eating you? I'm worried about Mayor Earhart, he said. Ember cocked an eyebrow. You think they might try to take a shot at her while we're gone? Cedric shook his head. No, that's not it. Ember sighed. What then? Cedric looked back toward the half-ship building which held Driftwood City Hall. Think about it for a moment. Dr. Acosta went missing right around the time of the explosion. According to Constable Cassidy, she was the only one at City Hall at the time other than her secretary. Ember scoffed. What? Are you saying that she let him go? Cedric shrugged his broad shoulders. Let him go, or disposed of him some other way. Cedric, do you really think Amelia Earhart cold-bloodedly murdered her ex-lover and then framed Dr. Acosta, then faked his escape so that she could cover up her crime? That sounds more like something Hoffa would come up with. Who knows how long she's been trapped in this dimension? Castaway syndrome is a real thing. She may have been driven to madness by her long incarceration in this dimension, don't you think? Ember sighed. Cedric, does Mayor Earhart seem mad to you? No, he said with a helpless laugh. Can't rightly say that she does. Cassidy cupped his hands beside his mouth and bellowed at the gathered posse. All right, listen up. We're going to light out here in a moment. We'll be following Sharptooth River to keep from getting lost in the change fields. It's Sharptooth mating season, so don't stray too close to the riverbank. Once we reach Dragonhell Gorge, we'll circle back toward Driftwood. What if we don't find him, Constable? Asked Ambrose Bierce. We keep looking until we find him, confirm his death, or I get tired. And everybody knows Butch Cassidy never gets tired. Move out. He surged ahead on his motorcycle. The posse followed in bits and pieces. Ember and Cedric found themselves near the end of the line. As they drove one of the slower vehicles, they wound up sharing space with the camp followers meant to attend to Emperor Romulus, who of course didn't deign to give his servants better transport than their own 2 feet. Ember found the landscape possessed of a stark beauty all its own. While she longed to see blue skies with a cheerful yellow sun beaming down at her again, she could appreciate the dimension's harsh extremes of brutality and breathtaking wonder. She glanced over at Cedric and found him smiling back at her. He gestured about them. This is something else. A winged shape flashed overhead, not much larger than a sparrow. Ember smiled as it resolved itself into a bioluminescent starfish-type creature. Yes, it is, Ember said. We always wanted to go on vacation. I guess that's one word for this misadventure, Cedric said. He cleared his throat and looked solemn for a moment. Listen, Ember, if things get dangerous, I want you to run. Run all the way back to Driftwood if you have to. I'll do no such thing, Ember said. You may not remember, but we face things together, Cedric. You're not going to send me to the women and children's table. Not now, not ever. Cedric cocked an eyebrow. I'm sorry, I didn't mean... I'm glad you care about me, Cedric, Ember said. Even without your memories. It means a lot to me. But that doesn't mean you get to change the rules of our marriage even if you don't remember them. An ear-piercing shriek split the air. Ember gaped as a scaled dragon swooped down toward the posse. They were under attack. Chapter 20. Ember opened up herself to the leyline energy pulsing through the landscape and shaped it into a spell. The sounds of gunfire ripped from further up their line as Yang's men fired upon the attacking beasts. They don't breathe fire, do they? Cedric asked. No. That's a relief. They spit lightning instead. I believe this is a type of beast called a behir. Perhaps this is their native plane of existence. Ember stared up into the blood-red skies, seeing no less than 7 of the beasts swooping about. As she watched, one opened its toothy maw and sent a green fork of lighting down into the Chinese line. A great gout of earth shot up, along with flying bodies. A split second after impact, the shockwave hit Ember and nearly knocked her from her feet. We can't fight them effectively while they're in the air, Cedric said. Do you have any magic that might ground them? Ash and I created a cyclone once before, but it would be too dangerous to use around all these mundane people. Cedric's eyes went wide. Down. He tackled her to the ground as a dragon swept by overhead. Her hair and clothing splayed out in a wild dance from the wind generated by the beast's passage. If not for Cedric, the dragon would have snatched her up off the ground in its claws for certain. If not swallowed her down its cavernous throat. The Imperial Guard formed a circle around Romulus's van. His howdah retracted downward inside the van, protecting him from view. Ember knew the car might be the safest place from the dragon's lightning breath. 4 rubber tires meant a degree of insulation. Hoffa's crew had a harder time than the Chinese brigadiers. The gangsters fought individually instead of as a team, leading to them being hard-pressed to defend themselves. Cedric pointed into the sky. If you can't get them on the ground, can you get me into the air? Ember pursed her lips. Maybe. Get in the golf cart. I'll try to enchant it with a fly spell. I thought you said metal was resistant to magic. Resistant doesn't mean immune. Ember gathered her energy together and shaped it with intention. She surrounded the golf cart with a defensive barrier, and then began the laborious task of making it fly. The strange energies of the dimension added impetus and an almost radioactive influence to her magic. Thus, Ember wasn't shocked when the golf cart sprouted 20-foot feathered wings. Surprised, but not shocked. What did you do? Cedric gaped. What happened to the steering wheel? He now held reins in his hands, the steering wheel shaped away by the magic. I imagine it's like riding a horse. Horses don't fly. Well, don't just sit there, try something. The golf cart shot into the air, wings beating furiously. Ember and Cedric screamed as they careened between 2 swooping dragons. They missed being crushed between the 2 behemoths by a few inches. The drone of the great beast's wings drowned out almost all other sounds. I need to go on the attack, Cedric growled. Are you crazy? Ember asked, clutching onto the golf cart's metal frame for dear life. Take the reins, Cedric shouted. He shifted into his hybrid form and leaped out of the front of the golf cart. Ember screamed as she snagged the reins and slid over into the driver's position. She watched in terror as Cedric plummeted through the air, fur flying wildly. He landed atop a dragon about to breathe lightning onto Ambrose Bierce and slashed at the scaled behemoth with claws and teeth. His frenzied assault made the dragon give up on its attack. Instead, the dragon twisted about in a spiral. Cedric held on with just his jaws, body dangling first above, then below the twisting dragon. Ember couldn't believe she was watching her husband fight a dragon, in an alternate dimension, with the first emperor of the Roman Empire. All so she could recover her wolf-shifter husband's stolen memories. Ember wondered exactly what god of fate she'd so displeased as to be cast into such an unlikely scenario. Cedric reached the lump of muscle where the dragon's insect wings met its scaled body. He grasped the mylar-esque wing in his clawed hand and tore it right out at the root. Ember winced in sympathy as the dragon dropped hard to its right. Cedric loped along its serpentine body, running on all fours all the way to the tip of its snout. He launched himself at another beast, this time latching onto the monster's underbelly. The dragon let out an agonized roar as Cedric slashed and ripped through its scaled hide. Ember struggled to control the winged golf cart. It had been years since she'd ridden a horse, and there were extra straps which made no sense. She had puzzled out that the thickest of the reins was used to make the golf cart ascend higher in the iron skies. Getting down remained a mystery. The glimpses she managed to catch of the battle showed it going well for her side. Many of the dragons lay felled on the blasted landscape as the soldiers picked off stragglers. Other survivors looked for the dead and injured, trusting their allies to mop up the last of the dragons. Ember felt as much as heard a resounding, rumbling roar. She looked ahead and her mouth fell open in horror. A dragon 3 times the size of the biggest she'd seen before lay directly in her path. A scream ripped from her mouth as it opened its gigantic maw. Ember flew right inside. Chapter 21. A fetid, sulfur-like odor enveloped Ember like an unwanted hot wind as she plunged into the colossal dragon's maw. She drew back on the reins, trying to get her golf cart steed to halt and do an about-face. The pitch blackness of the dragon's mouth and throat gave way to a flickering illumination as lightning crackled deeper in the dragon's neck. Ember realized the beast was about to unleash its lightning breath, and she had nowhere to run. The dragon's smaller cousins had spat lines of lightning up to 10 feet wide. Ember tried and failed to calculate just how big this monster's lightning breath might be. She had to do something. And soon. Ember knew there was no time to escape back out the dragon's open mouth, even though she'd managed to rein in the winged golf cart. She instead concentrated on a spell which would make her, and the golf cart by proxy, immune to electricity. Ember finished the enchantment just in time. She threw an arm up over her eyes as the lighting flashes in the dragon's belly grew blinding in their brilliance. The hairs stood up on her skin, and then the searing electrical bolt enveloped her and the cart. The spell insulated Ember from most of the lightning bolt's deadly effect, but the force of it still shot her out of the dragon's maw like it was the barrel of a cannon. Ember caught a brief flash of teeth the size of one-story buildings before she flew up and out into the iron-red skies. The golf cart spun end over end, and all Ember could do was hold on and not let go. Ember struggled to regain control as the winged golf cart began a death spiral toward the ground. "Come on," she said, struggling with the reins. "Come on, fly, that's what you've got wings for. Fly." To Ember's immense relief, the wings flared out wide, slowing her descent considerably. She finagled the reins enough to begin a spiral descent for the craggy ground far below. At least they finished off the other dragons, she thought. What were they to do with the colossal monster which nearly swallowed her whole? She hoped Cedric wouldn't try to throw himself at that beast as well. Ember looked down to the ground. She saw Cedric, still in his hybrid form, standing astride one of the fallen dragons. Ember realized the posse couldn't possibly deal with even a single lighting breath from the giant dragon. There was nothing for it. She had to try and lead the dragon away from the posse. Ember snapped the reins and started climbing again. She angled the winged golf cart about until the gigantic dragon came into view. To her horror, it had taken note of the posse and now angled itself toward them. "No!" Ember snapped the reins and shot out toward the enormous beast. She drew her pistol with her free hand and fired a barrage of shots at the dragon's 10-foot-wide eye. The dragon's lid squeezed shut for a moment. Then its eye opened, the vertical pupil narrowing as it focused on her and the golf cart. "Well, that got his attention," Ember said. "Here we go." Ember turned the golf cart about and spurted on to maximum speed. The dragon split the air with a truly thunderous roar behind her. She led the dragon away from the posse, checking over her shoulder when she had a spare moment to ensure it still followed her. Come on," Ember muttered to herself as the dragon seemed to gain on her. "Faster. We've got to go faster, or we'll be nothing more than a spot of indigestion in that monster's belly." Despite her pleas, the golf cart could go no faster. Ember felt a blast of its foul, sulfurous breath hit her from behind. She dared a glance over her shoulder and saw that the dragon's gigantic maw was less than 20 feet behind her. Ember looked about for something, anything she could strip off the golf cart so it would fly faster. Finding nothing, she chanted the words to a minor summoning cantrip. Suddenly, the air behind the winged golf cart was alive with a flock of 100 pigeons. They flew into the dragon's face, some down its throat, and the beast turned its head to the side. Its progress slowed enough Ember began to pull ahead again. She checked behind her and couldn't see the posse any longer. Ember hoped that meant she'd successfully led the beast away from Cedric and the others. Now all that remained was to free herself from its clutches. Ember's eyes scanned the ground below, looking for a place to hide. Nothing presented itself. Only a few feeble cliffs which would likely crumble under the gigantic beast's weight. "Oh no!" Ember cried as the dragon's maw lit up with the crackle of lighting. "Not again!" The lightning blast enveloped her. As before, her shield spell held, insulating her from the lightning's deadly embrace. Ember screamed as the lightning belch launched her like a rocket through the blood-red skies, utterly and completely out of control. The golf cart's feathered wings shredded into tatters, sending her spiraling toward the ground with nothing but a sudden stop, and certain death awaiting her at the bottom. Chapter 22. Ember saw the ground rushing up toward her as the reins in her hands morphed back into a steering wheel. The wind, tearing at her garments and hair, rushed down her throat so swiftly she could scarcely breathe. Her hands grasped the steering wheel in a white-knuckle grip. Ember's mind raced as she tried to figure a way out of her speeding death trap. The fly spell had worked once before. Maybe it would work again. With few other options, she began the chant, thanking the powers that be for the powerful ley line energy of that dimension. To her relief, new wings sprouted out from the sides of the golf cart and flared out, acting as parachutes to slow her descent. Ember pulled up hard on the reins, and the golf cart's nose slowly edged up. "Come on, come on!" The ground was less than 20 feet away. Then 10, then 5, when the golf cart finally leveled off. Ember bounced around inside the passenger compartment as the wheels skidded along rises in the land. Slowly, she pulled back into the air. Ember cast her gaze about, searching for the behemoth dragon. She deflated in relief as she saw it flying off toward the west, the opposite direction of Driftwood and the posse. Ember steered the winged golf cart higher into the red skies. Lightning flashed all around her as she peered intently through the permanent gloom. She caught a glimpse of the posse in a flash of lighting and focused intently on maintaining course toward it. She descended toward the ground in a controlled spiral. Ember chuckled when she saw every faction of the posse scavenging off the dragon corpses. Ember set the golf cart down gently with a final beat of its feathered wings. Cedric rushed to her side and they embraced tightly. Ember sighed, basking in Cedric's familiar feel and scent. "I saw you go down the dragon's throat," Cedric said. "What happened?" "I guess you could say I rode the lightning," Ember quipped. She kissed him on the cheek, then her smile faded. "How many casualties?" Cedric's jaw set hard. Captain Yang's unit was hit the hardest. They lost 5 men. Hoffa's boys lost 2, and the Romans didn't fight, so they didn't lose anyone. They'd have lost every single man if I hadn't led that colossal dragon away. Ember glanced fearfully off in the direction the behemoth flew away in and shuddered. I didn't know they got that big. Cedric shook his head as he stared fretfully at the skies. Hopefully that's as big as they get. "Did you have to go and jinx us?" Ember sighed. "So, we're making camp or what?" "Just long enough to have a quick meal, scavenge meat from the dead dragons, and bury the dead." Cedric looked up at the sky and scowled. "Without the sun, it's hard to tell day from night here. Cassidy doesn't want to let Dr. Acosta get too much of a head start. I still don't think he killed D.B. Cooper. It doesn't feel right." Ember crossed her arms over her chest and glared at the other members of the posse. Not that these guys care in the least. They're out for blood, even Constable Cassidy. "Then we'll have to make sure we find Dr. Acosta first and protect him," Cedric said firmly. "Easier said than done." Ember frowned as a runner from the Roman encampment jogged toward them. "Oh, good grief. What is this now? Can't Romulus leave us alone?" Cedric chuckled. "Apparently not." The runner approached within a few feet and dropped to one knee, cape fluttering in the breeze. "I bring a message from Emperor Romulus. He requests your presence, milady." "Let's go see what the Emperor wants," Ember sighed. "The invitation is for the woman only," the runner said. Cedric laughed. "Fine, she can take care of herself. In fact, my wife is more dangerous than I am." Ember squeezed Cedric's forearm and then followed the runner to Emperor Romulus's van palanquin. The doors had been flung wide open, revealing an opulent gilded interior, complete with a padded divan. The Emperor lounged on the pillow, drinking some kind of spirits from a silver mug. "Ah, Ember, isn't it? Please, come in." Ember eyed the interior and shook her head. "Sorry. Mama told me never to get into a van with a strange man. What is it I can do for you, Romulus?" "Emperor Romulus," he corrected politely. "It's not what you can do for me, but what I may do for you. I understand you're married to some low-level law enforcement agent?" "You understand correctly." Romulus shrugged. "It is of no importance. Your wedlock is not legally recognized by the Empire." "Why would I care in the least about that?" Ember asked with a sigh. "Because that means there are no barriers between us joining our houses and lines together," Romulus said, his dark eyes shining in the half-light of the van. "Think about it. Instead of being a mere wife, you could be an empress." Ember's eyes went wide. "Wait a second, are you seriously asking me to marry you?" "Why not? You are comely, wise, and possess many strange abilities which set you apart from mortal women. Imagine what we could create if we joined forces. We could easily wrest Driftwood away from the Earhart woman's grasp. Then we could—" "Let me stop you right there," Ember said with a laugh. "I'm going to have to decline your offer, Emperor." "Decline?" Romulus sputtered. "What woman would dare spurn the proposal of an emperor?" Ember shrugged. "This one does. Good day." She couldn't resist a smile as she strode away from the infuriated, sputtering Roman emperor. Chapter 23. The posse picked up their camp and prepared to move out. Cedric stood beside the golf cart, changing a tire which had been flattened during Ember's mad flight from the colossal dragon. Ember rested on a nearby boulder with a relatively flat top. Channeling so much magic in recent days left her feeling run down and tired. She remembered the way she'd been able to use dark magic to insulate herself from the burnout of magic, and wondered if that was why Cassandra and her ilk found it so appealing. According to witch lore, dark magic demanded more and more of its practitioners, until the insulating effect was more than counterbalanced by the toll evil forces took on the body. She could understand why one would be tempted by its use, however, quite easily. Cedric finished with the tire and carefully eased the golf cart back to all four wheels. Ember looked to the front of the line, curious as to why they hadn't moved yet. Constable Cassidy jogged back to them, his face crossed with a grave scowl. "Have either of you seen Mr. Bierce?" Cassidy asked. Ember's brow furrowed. "No, I haven't seen him since right before the dragons attacked." "Same story everywhere," Cassidy said, spitting into the dirt. "I think he's been abducted." "With all respect, Constable," Cedric said, "are you sure he wasn't eaten? Or blasted apart by lightning?" Despite his seeming bravado, Mr. Bierce chose to ride out the attack under the bed of a pickup. No one remembers seeing him during the fight. Ember stroked her chin thoughtfully. "Could we see this truck? Has it been moved yet?" "Yes and no," Cassidy replied. "Follow me." Cassidy led them to a rusted pickup truck, its lime green paint largely flaked away. She squatted down, Cedric by her side, to check underneath. "Look at the drag marks," Ember said, pointing at long streaks in the dusty plain. "Not consistent with scrambling out on all fours." Cedric nodded. If someone grabbed Bierce's arms and pulled him out, it would look a lot like this. "I thought as much," Cassidy said. "The terrain around here is too hard, it doesn't hold prints. I don't know how we're going to track him." "I have an idea of how we can find him," Cedric said. "I'm wondering who took him, though." Cassidy snorted. "Who do you think? Who have we been tracking this whole time?" "Dr. Acosta? Why would he kidnap Bierce?" "Kill the one eyewitness to his crime?" Cassidy offered. "Or get him to recant his false testimony," Ember said. "I still don't think Acosta is our culprit." "Who then?" Cassidy shrugged. "Romulus? One of his men?" "I don't know." Ember shook her head. "I do know we need to find them." Both of them. She looked expectantly at Cedric. He nodded and dropped down to all fours. By the time his hands touched the dirt, they had become furry paws. Cassidy took a step back, hand reflexively going to his revolver as the big gray wolf snuffled and snorted with its snout in the dirt. Cedric lifted his head and let out a piercing howl, then loped off toward the east. He went a dozen paces, then stopped to look over his shoulder. I think he wants us to follow him. Ember chuckled. You think? Cedric will track down our missing townsfolk. They followed Cedric, accompanied by the rest of the posse. Cedric led them into a plain so heavily strewn with rubble, they had to abandon their vehicles and move in on foot. Many of the jagged boulders were less than waist-high to Ember, but some towered more than 20 feet into the sky. Great place for an ambush, Cassidy said warily. Cedric will alert us if there's something wicked afoot, Ember said softly. Cassidy pursed his lips as he looked at Ember. The mayor and Captain Yang say that you've got something they can only describe as magic. Is that true? Ember nodded. It's true. Does that mean you don't trust me any longer? I reckon that's not the case. I'm just curious as to why you can't magic up Dr. Acosta for us. Ember shook her head. It doesn't work quite as easily as all of that. Magic is an unnatural force and is best used sparingly for very specific purposes. Plus, I don't know Acosta nearly well enough to attempt any such thing. You're a witch and your husband is a werewolf, Cassidy said with a chuckle. What a rip. He's a shifter, actually. Werewolves are cursed to change during the full moon and become mindless killers. Cedric retains his mental faculties. Hold up. Ember saw Cedric snuffling around by the base of one of the larger boulders. She turned sideways and squeezed through a narrow aperture and came to his side. Cedric adopted his human form and pointed at the base. This one's been hollowed out by the wind. There's a cave that connects to a cavern complex. Ember stared into the inky darkness. She summoned a globe of light and sent it inside. Ghostly emerald light shone down the tunnel, revealing something small laying on the tunnel floor. What's that? Cedric asked. He walked into the cave and picked up a worn leather shoe. Bierce's footgear, Ember replied. We're close. A blood-curdling scream echoed from deeper inside the cave. Ember and Cedric scrambled toward the exit as something charged out of the darkness. Chapter 24. Cedric shoved Ember ahead of him through the tunnel. She stumbled back under the red skies, Cedric a step behind. He turned around and reached for his gun, but a shape blasted out of the tunnel and tackled him. They rolled in the dirt for several feet while Ember shrieked and tried to figure out a way to help. Cedric managed to get on top of his enemy, pinning the shape down to the dirt under his bulk. His eyes widened in surprise. Dr. Acosta? He asked. How do you know that name? Acosta demanded. Are you CIA, FBI, Interpol, stormtroopers? Dr. Acosta, where is Ambrose Bierce? Ember demanded, crouching down beside the man's head. What have you done with him? Acosta's turgid face contorted into a frown. Who's Ambrose Bierce? Ember groaned with exasperation. The man you kidnapped. I kidnapped somebody? Acosta asked with such utter sincerity Cedric and Ember exchanged glances. Yes, you did, Cedric growled. Now what did you do with him? Is he in that cave? That's not a cave, it's the left nostril of a woolly mammoth from Titan. What? Ember shook her head and sighed. That makes no sense. Acosta rolled his eyes. Don't you read? Titan is one of Saturn's moons, the place most likely to support life in our solar system. Duh. Ember wiped a hand down her face. I don't think he's going to be much help, Cedric. Me neither. Let's drop him off with Constable Cassidy and then we'll check out this cave. Acosta offered no resistance as they accompanied him back to the posse. Cassidy tried questioning the good doctor, with no more success than Cedric had enjoyed. He insisted on sending some of Yang's men with them for protection. Hold, Constable, Romulus bellowed. You'll not steal all the glory of this rescue yourself. I demand some of my legionnaires accompany you. We're coming too, said one of Hoffa's men with a glower. We don't trust the newcomers. Fine, the more the merrier, Cassidy said. I'll stay back here with the rest of the posse and make sure Dr. Acosta doesn't sneak away again. In short order, Ember and Cedric led the way back to the boulder. Aided by flashlights and Ember's magic globes, they traversed the tunnel and discovered it contained a downward grade. This cavern complex is bigger than it looks, Ember said. It would be easy to get lost. You're right. Cedric cocked an eyebrow. I can shift into wolf form, if you can figure out a way to find the path back. Ember reached into her purse and withdrew a small ball of yarn. She chanted the words to the spell and tossed the yarn in the air. It hovered, suspended in the air by magic as the strands took on a faint silver glow. The free end snaked through the air like a living thing, streaming back toward the surface. Just like Theseus and the Minotaur, Ember said with a grin. Want to get all wolfy and track down Ambrose Bierce? I'm on it. Cedric paused. Have you ever read Bierce's story? Owl Creek Bridge, right? I think so, in junior high. About a guy who gets hung and has this wild escape fantasy before he dies? Yeah. You have to wonder about a guy who writes something like that. You don't trust his testimony? Ember asked. Cedric shook his head. When I was grappling with the doctor, I realized two things. 1, he's not a very good fighter, and 2, he lacks the instincts for murder. Given his proclivity for hallucinogenic substances, Dr. Acosta would make a great scapegoat, don't you think? Yes, Ember said. All too convenient of a scapegoat, in fact. We need to find Bierce. Cedric nodded. His form shifted in the blink of an eye into his four-legged wolf body. Cedric placed his nose to the stone floor and snuffled. His toenails clicked as Cedric padded off into the darkness. Ember followed, the line of soldiers and mobsters trickling along behind her. How did I end up in an alternate dimension fighting dragons beside gangsters and ancient Roman soldiers while hunting an alcoholic early American author? Oh yeah, I'm trying to find my husband's memories, which were sucked out of his head by a winged bat demon. I miss the days when I ran a tavern. Thanks to Cedric's nose, they were easily able to navigate the honeycomb tunnels. Ember lost track of how long they were below ground. She noted the posse didn't want to get too close to her. The magic she'd unleashed so far had not gone unnoticed. Ember couldn't decide if their prejudice was really against her magic or her perceived sex. Men with magic were Merlin and Moses, performing miracles for the good of all. Women with magic were Maleficent and Morgan Le Fay, the villains of the story. In any event, she had endured enough of Driftwood. Her heart went out to the refugees, but she couldn't wait to get back to Louisiana where she belonged. Ember caught sight of the blood-red ski as she came around a bend. Cedric stood at the exit in his wolf form, tail wagging excitedly. She followed him out into the open, the ball of string at her side remaining fixed at the exit. Cedric adopted his human guise as they waited for the rest of the posse to exit into the open. Cedric finished his head count and turned to Ember. That's all of them accounted for. Ember stared out at the wide, sandy plain ahead of her. Dunes broke up the landscape, their blue and green morass like the humps of submerged whales in a sand sea. This is where he went? Likely he got lost down in the tunnels, Cedric replied. This is where his scent led me. Sand doesn't hold odors very well, and with the high winds, I don't think I can track him further than this. Ember sighed. Then we've no choice but to do it the old-fashioned way. Pass the word along. Have every team member call out Ambrose's name. Maybe he'll hear us. She gestured at the desert. We'll head out until just over half our water is gone, and then we'll turn back. If we don't find Bierce by then... Cedric nodded. We'll have done all we can. I'll pass the word along. After a short rest, the party continued on. Ember trudged up to the top of a high dune and cupped her hands to her mouth, calling Ambrose's name. Only the rumble of thunder and the whistling wind greeted her calls. They traveled for miles through the desert. Ember soon discovered it was preferable to slip her shoes off and continue barefooted. Otherwise, she had to stop every 100 yards and empty her shoes. She cast a minor cantrip to protect her soles and continued to lead the way. Behind her, the echoes of voices calling for Bierce rose up over the dunes. Ember sipped from her canteen and swished it around. About 3/4 left. Soon they'd have to turn back. A bright flash overhead caught her attention. Thinking it a particularly brilliant blast of lighting, Ember's interest was only casual until she saw the truth. The larger dune adjacent to her own sparked with the beginnings of a portal 3 times the size of the one which had brought Ember and Ash across dimensions. Something pushed its way through the thin membrane between dimensions and stepped onto the sand on legs as big as tree trunks. It was a dinosaur, and it wasn't alone. Chapter 25. Incoming! Ember shouted as the dinosaur extended its long giraffe-like neck toward the red sky. Its movements seemed oddly slow due to its massive size. The dinosaur staggered out of the portal as another shoved in behind it, and another. Brachiosaurs, Cedric said, a big smile on his face. I never thought I'd see a living one. Look, their tails stick straight out behind them instead of dragging on the ground. Ember glanced at Cedric incredulously. Are you kidding me? Now is not the time to engage in your hitherto undisclosed dinosaur fetish. We have to run. More of the brachiosaurs thundered through the portal by the moment, and already they clustered at the base of the large dune. Ember could see that, by following the path of least resistance, the dinosaurs would likely come up and over the dune she stood upon next. You're right, he said. Cedric took her hand and they fled up the slope to the top of the dune. Cedric waved his arms when they reached the top, shaking his head. No, go back. Run. Confusion reigned on the dune, with some of the soldiers attempting to flee but most standing about looking at Ember and Cedric with suspicion. Ember heard bleating from the brachiosaurs behind them, and gasped as she saw them surging up the dune. No more time, she said, grabbing Cedric's hand and tugging him along. They ran headlong down the dune, wove through the frozen posse members, and rushed on. They steered toward more open ground, reasoning the dinosaurs would have more room to spread out. When the first brachiosaur stumbled over the top of the dune, the other posse members exploded into flight. One of the mobsters outdistanced Cedric and Ember, hoofing it onto a sandy plateau and leaving gouts of sand in his wake. They believe us now, Ember shouted. The air filled with the bleats of the brachiosaurs, the thunder of their feet, and the screams and shouts of men fleeing for their lives. A hulking shape trundled past and ahead of Ember. She missed being trampled by a matter of 2 feet. Move laterally, Cedric said, gesturing for her to follow. Ember moved after Cedric, drifting off to her left toward the edge of the aqua dune sea. An ear-splitting roar thundered across the sandy plain. Ember couldn't resist looking back to see the source of the terrible sound. Oh no, she gasped. That's what the brachiosaurs were running from. Cedric hissed. Sweet Christmas, is that what I think it is? A 2-legged, fanged monstrosity thudded onto the sandy plain. Its splayed jaws were large enough to encompass both of them with room to spare. It moved with surprising speed, rushing along beside a brachiosaur and snapping its jaws along the herbivore's flank. The brachiosaurs fled across the plain, outdistancing the Tyrannosaurus rex, but not the humans. The T-Rex slowed, sweeping its great head about as its eyes took in the scene. Cedric drew his gun. I'll try to draw it off. You try and run. Ember sneered. I'm not about to let my husband sacrifice himself to save me. The T-Rex ran up on a Roman soldier separated from the others of his unit. The soldier fired with his bolt-action rifle, but if he hit the T-Rex, it gave no sign. It didn't slow down one iota as it bent low and closed its jaws over him, silencing his scream. A group of Romans and Yang's men formed a defensive line and fired on the dinosaur. The T-Rex flinched under the assault, staggering a few feet away and closing its saurian eyes. Ember saw small rivulets of blood running down its thick hide and hoped their gunfire would at least drive the beast away. Oh no, Ember said as the T-Rex's blood drops hit the sand. We've got more problems. What's that? The abundant magic of this dimension twists everything, Ember said. The T-Rex's blood is forming a conduit between the ley lines and its body. What does that mean? The T-Rex's jaws opened wide, impossibly wide. Bones cracked as its form reshaped, morphing into a spiny armored form. The bullets ceased to penetrate its hide, instead reflecting off shiny plates like beetle chitin. It means this fight just got a whole lot tougher. The mutated T-Rex turned toward the sandy ridge where the posse had taken up their defensive line. It roared, jaw crammed with even more spiky teeth than before, and charged up the slope. The men's bullets seemed useless. They might as well be spitting at it, Ember said in horror. The T-Rex bent low and snapped its jaws shut, narrowly missing a Chinese rifleman who scrambled down the slope. He ran across the plain as the T-Rex gave chase. Its toothy maw spread wide, a gooey strand of saliva connecting the two halves of its jaw. Ember summoned power from the ley lines and chanted a variation of her sand staircase spell. Rather than a shaped construct, which she lacked time for, a 10-foot-wide pillar of sand surged up and struck the T-Rex in the eyes. The beast roared, staggering hard to the left as it shook its head to clear the granules away. Ember sighed with relief as the soldier struggled up to the top of a dune and disappeared over the other side. She'd saved him. Cedric said, backing away slowly. I think you made it mad. The T-Rex swung its head toward them, its left eye squeezed mostly shut. It roared in pain and rage, making Ember's knees go weak. The dinosaur charged, moving with a swiftness they could never hope to outrun. Chapter 26. The armored T-Rex bellowed a challenge, its roar ringing in Ember's ears even after its maw snapped shut. She could feel the impact each time it planted a three-toed foot on the plain. It strode toward them with murderous intent in its dinner plate-sized eye. What are we going to do? Ember asked. Any ideas? Just one. Cedric bolted from her side, tearing up gouts of aqua-hued sand in his wake. Ember gaped as he fled a dozen feet away. The mutated T-Rex continued on toward Ember in spite of Cedric's flight. Hey, over here! Cedric jumped up and down, waving his arms. What are you doing? Ember asked, aghast. Cedric drew his pistol and fired at the T-Rex. Ember started at the nearby retort, a puff of white smoke carried away on desert winds. The T-Rex wasn't harmed, but the great fanged head swung Cedric's way. Yeah, that's it, come and get me. Cedric fired again and holstered his weapon as the T-Rex charged in. Cedric, you're not about to sacrifice yourself so I can escape. I won't stand for it, Ember shouted. Cedric kept his gaze locked on the oncoming beast as he spoke. I'm not sacrificing myself. I'm keeping it busy long enough for you to figure out a plan and magic us out of this mess. What if I can't? The T-Rex charged in, scaled lower jaw less than a foot from the sandy plain. Cedric shifted into his hybrid form and dove to the side at the last moment. The T-Rex's jaws snapped shut on empty air as Cedric scrambled on all fours under the dinosaur's belly. Cedric raked his claws along the armored underside, scoring little more than superficial scratches. The T-Rex bellowed and leaped backward like a grounded bird. Ember was startled by the speed and suddenness of the movement. Cedric found himself exposed to the monstrous mutant. He feinted to the left, then the right, the T. Rex matching him move for move. It moved like a bird. Ember knew modern-day avian species descended from dinosaurs like the T-Rex. She pored over how she might put that knowledge to use. The T-Rex stomped in to engulf Cedric in its jaws once again. He leaped onto the creature's snout, then ran along its head and made it to the turtle shell-like back. Ember let go of the breath she'd been holding. The T-Rex spun around in tight circles, arching its neck as best it could. So long as Cedric remained on the shell, his safety was assured. The T-Rex found itself hampered by its own body, unable to flex enough to get the pest off its back. She shook off her mental fugue and focused. A spell. A spell. A spell. There must be a spell to deal with the beast. Killing such a large animal would require channeling an enormous amount of energy through herself, maybe enough to be lethal. If she didn't succeed, would the T-Rex mutate again to be magic resistant? Ember thought of dark magic. Maybe just once, just one time she could get away with using it. Just once to save her husband. Ember shook her head and growled. No, it wouldn't stop at just one time. There was a way out of this. There had to be. She watched as the T-Rex shook itself mightily. Cedric struggled to hold on, his sharp claws sparking off of bony plates. The T-Rex spun in a tight circle and bucked like a rodeo bronco. Cedric flipped up into the air. The T-Rex lifted its head skyward, maw wide open. Ember's hand flew in front of her face as her husband tumbled toward the cavernous, toothy maw. Cedric twisted in midair and grabbed onto the T-Rex's face. His claws latched onto the ridges hanging over the creature's widely spaced eyes. The T-Rex shook its head, then turned to its left and charged hard, head low to the sandy ground. Ember shrieked as the T-Rex bull rushed into a sand dune, leading with its head and Cedric. Sand exploded outward in a wide nimbus, obscuring her husband and the dinosaur's upper body for a moment. When the sand settled, Cedric lay upside down in a divot, half buried in sand. He reverted to his human form as the T. Rex shook its head and blinked away the sand. It spotted the helpless Cedric, nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. The dinosaur bent over, jaws spread wide, sharp teeth about to devour the unconscious man. No! Ember cast the one spell on the tip of her tongue, a charm meant to charm birds out of their trees. Would it work on a T-Rex? It moved like a giant bird. The T-Rex paused at the sound of her chanting and the shrill whistle which followed. It turned its massive head toward her, nostrils flaring. The T-Rex stomped across the plain toward Ember. She didn't flee, knowing she would never outrun such a monster. Either her spell worked and she had charmed the T-Rex, or it was about to devour her. Chapter 27. The T-Rex loomed over Ember, blotting out the crimson, lightning-racked skies above. It bent its head low, nostrils flaring. Ember's hair flew back under the force of its breathy pants. Ember gingerly reached her hand out toward the scaled beast. Her limb trembled so terribly she could barely hold it aloft. When her hand settled on the warm, leathery scales, she gasped. "Hey there," she said in a voice scant louder than a whisper. The T-Rex snuffled and reared up to its full height, looking down at Ember in query. "You're waiting for a command, aren't you?" Ember said. "You might be separated from modern birds by millions of years of evolution, but the magic doesn't care. As far as the magic is concerned, you're just a really big bird." Ember snapped her fingers and pointed at the ground, picturing an image of the T-Rex with its head bowed low. The dinosaur obeyed her mental command, much to her delight. Ember scrambled up onto the creature's shoulders, aided by the wide ridge where shell met neck. It made for a comfortable enough perch. "Let's go." She pictured the T-Rex moving over to where Cedric stirred in the sand. He scrambled up to his feet, face growing lupine as he began to shift. When he saw Ember astride the T-Rex, he ceased trying to remove his human guise. "Did I hit my head harder than I thought?" Cedric asked. Ember chuckled. "Come on, climb aboard. We'll be able to see a lot further if we search for beers from up here." "Are you sure he won't bite?" Cedric asked. "Until the next full moon, he's as tame as a puppy." "This place doesn't have a moon." Ember frowned. "Then we'd better hurry. Who knows when the enchantment will wear off." "You can cast it again, right?" Cedric asked, staring at the giant saurian. "Yes, I can cast it again, right?" Ember sighed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, will you quit fussing and just get on the back of the carnosaur?" Cedric relented, climbing up beside her on the natural shelf made by the dragon's hard shell. Ember directed the dinosaur to move in a grid pattern across the desert. Cedric took the left, Ember the right, as they scanned and scoured the sandy sea for any sign of the author. "You know," Cedric said out of nowhere, startling Ember, "when Emperor Romulus proposed marriage to you, I got mighty jealous." Ember cocked an eyebrow. "I thought he only mentioned that to me." Cedric pointed at his ears. "In this place, with all the abundant magical energy to be had, I have many of the traits of wolves even in my human form. I can smell and hear like a wolf. Ember laughed. So you heard his proposal? You have to know I would never seriously consider it. Cedric pursed his lips. Why not? Ember felt her cheeks flush. Well, because you might not remember it, but I took a vow, a sacred vow, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health. Ember! Cedric reached out and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. It's all right, I don't know where all this is coming from. Cedric frowned. I do. You've taken on a huge amount of responsibility ever since we came to this dimension. Plus, your husband is an amnesiac, and we've fought dragons and dinosaurs and bootleggers. Ember laughed. What's your point? My point is, this is enough to make anyone cry. If I were you, I'd be bawling. Ember sighed, her smile fading away. You said you felt jealous? Very. Cedric looked at Ember, a solemn light in his eyes. If you're worried that you have to go across that strange ocean just so your husband will love you again, well, maybe you don't. Ember frowned, tamping down the hope lighting up her chest. What are you saying? Just what I did, Cedric replied. Cedric, you just sort of confessed your love for me, for the first time since you lost your memories. This is kind of a huge deal. You can't beat around the bush about stuff like this. You have to come out and say it. Cedric's mouth twitched. I just did say it, Ember. Come on, why are you making such a big deal out of this? I don't want you to get hurt trying to get my memories back. Our marriage doesn't have to end just because I can't remember the early parts of it. Ember rubbed her eyes. Cedric wanted to do this now, of all times? Riding the back of a dinosaur while looking for Ambrose Bierce in a strange dimension? Ambrose Bierce. Ember had forgotten him for a moment. They needed to find him before he died of dehydration or worse. This isn't over, Ember grumbled, but we need to table it for now and concentrate on finding Ambrose Bierce while we still have the T-Rex. Very well, Cedric said. He cupped his hands to his mouth and called out, Ambrose, Ambrose, Bierce. They continued on for hours, crisscrossing the dune sea in a diagonal pattern. Ember's eyes ached from the strain of trying to tell if the latest mirage was really the missing author's body. Ember, look, Cedric cried. She followed his pointing finger to a figure slumped against the lee side of a rocky shelf. She guided the T-Rex within a dozen feet of Bierce as Cedric vaulted off and sped across the sand to his side. They'd found Ambrose Bierce, the only alleged eyewitness to the murder of D.B. Cooper. But was he still alive? Chapter 28. Cedric crouched beside the still figure of Ambrose Bierce. The man's blousy shirt billowed in the wind, thrust up like a sail from the sea of sand. Ambrose had been half buried by the blowing sands, his face almost entirely hidden by the blue grit. Cedric gently rolled Ambrose over onto his back. He laid 2 fingers against Ambrose's neck while Ember watched with bated breath. Is he? Ember asked. No, he's alive, Cedric said. Barely. Do you have any magic that might help? Ember slid off the back of the dinosaur and moved over to Ambrose's side. The T-Rex peered down at them with apparent interest as she knelt beside Ambrose. See if you can get him to drink, Ember said. He has to be able to swallow in order for my spell to work. Cedric pulled out his canteen and unscrewed the cap. He tilted it over Ambrose's sand-encrusted face and lips. Ambrose didn't react at first, but gradually his eyes fluttered open and he struggled to swallow. Ambrose rose up into a sitting position, coughing and sputtering as a slurry of sand and water spilled from his mouth. Cedric sacrificed most of his canteen to Ambrose, allowing the author to rinse his mouth and then swallow big gulps of water. Ember opened her purse and withdrew a glass bottle from within. She eyed the contents, a dried, flattened bit of curled red ribbon. What is that? Cedric asked as Ambrose laid back on the sand, groaning. A pepper? Ember shook her head. Tail of salamander. Helps with regeneration and regrowth. She bit the cork in the end of the bottle and pried it loose. Ember reached her finger inside the bottle, and fished the preserved tail into the open. Using her pocket knife, she cut off a bit no larger than a fingernail clipping. "Is that all you need?" Cedric asked. "I might be using too much." Ember grinned. "Waste not, want not. Salamanders are very powerful magical creatures. This tail has been in my family for generations and has yet to be depleted fully." Ember chanted a spell over the sliver of salamander tail. It glowed with a brief but intense light, growing warm in her hand. "Quick, open his mouth," she said. "If it fades before he eats it, the spell will be ruined." "Here you go, Mr. Bierce," Cedric said, tilting Ambrose's head back. He shoved the piece of tail into Ambrose's mouth and closed his jaw. "Come on, chew it up. There you go." Ambrose swallowed. Disgust writ large over his face. He grabbed his throat and gasped as color returned to his skin. "Feeling better, Mr. Bierce?" Cedric asked. "I don't think so," Ambrose said. Cedric looked to Ember, who scowled. "Don't look at me. The magic worked. He should be healed. It's true my physical maladies no longer torment me, but I fear my mind is wandering in the halls of madness. Some demonic creature looms yonder, waiting with the patience of a steed." "Oh, right, this guy is a writer," Cedric said, rolling his eyes. "I can't stand writers." Ember cocked an eyebrow. "What's wrong with writers?" "Nothing, I guess, except that they're pretentious and try to corner you for hours and tell you about their novel and how it's going to be the next Ulysses. The worst ones are those who just churn out books for quick cash. Villains, the whole lot of them." Ember laughed. "A little louder, I don't think Mr. Bierce heard you." She locked gazes with the sand-crusted man. "All right, Mr. Bierce, don't worry about the dinosaur, just focus on me. I've gone to a whole lot of trouble to track you down and save your life, just so I could talk to you." "I am in your debt, milady," he said, bowing his head. "That's right," Ember said. "You owe me your life. I just want one thing from you, and we'll be square. One thing, and one thing only." Ambrose smiled. "Milady, you have but to name it, and if such a thing be within my power or purview, I will see it done." Ember scowled. "I certainly hope so. All right, Ambrose, answer me this. Did you really see Dr. Acosta going into the distillery with a sword the other night?" Ambrose flinched, then dropped his gaze to his lap. Cedric put a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, Ambrose. You can answer, it's the right thing to do." Ambrose heaved a heavy sigh. "Nay, I didn't see the man anywhere near D.B. Cooper's domicile." Ember smiled in triumph at Cedric. "Did you come up with the idea to incriminate Acosta on your own, or did someone put you up to it?" Ember asked. Ambrose's face crossed with a scowl. "Emperor Romulus bade me bear false witness against Mr. Cooper. He said that even if Dr. Acosta weren't guilty, getting rid of him would strengthen our community. That, and what? He agreed to patronize my writing. It's a struggle to create quality manuscripts, you know. They don't just grow on trees. Everyone thinks, oh, it would be so much fun to be a writer for a living, but it's hard work." Ember glanced over at Cedric. "I told you." "So that's why Acosta abducted you? To get you to recant?" Ambrose sighed. "I never know what that madman is up to or why. I only know that I'm very happy to be alive. I'll tell everyone at Driftwood that I lied." Cedric turned to Ember. "Satisfied?" "Not yet," she said. "If Acosta is innocent, then our killer is still at large." Chapter 29. Ember bade her mutated T-Rex steed farewell at the edge of the dune sea. As it trundled off into the distance, green lightning splitting the sky above, Cedric turned a frown on Ember. "Are you sure it was a good idea to let it go already? I imagine Romulus would have a pretty hard time whipping up an angry mob if you came into town riding that." Ember chuckled. "I have no idea when the charm spell on it will expire. Besides, it would terrify the rest of the posse if we came riding up on that. Might even get us attacked." Cedric grunted. "True enough. Can you get us through the caves again?" Ember nodded and produced her ball of string. "It will unravel in the same pattern as last time." Ambrose cleared his throat. Excuse me, but how do you create all these illusions? Mirrors? Hidden projectors? Ember sighed. I'm really tired of answering this question. The trio wormed their way beneath the rock and came out in the boulder field. From there, they had a short walk to where the posse was encamped. Cassidy stood up from a game of poker with the mobsters and hustled over to greet them. You found him, Cassidy said, face splitting in a wide grin. Well, I just lost a bet. How are you feeling, Mr. Bierce? I am well, thank you, Bierce said, tugging at his collar. Cedric cocked an eyebrow. Is it just me, or was that the shortest sentence he's ever uttered? Ember scowled. He's going to have to tell the entire town he's a liar. I'd be bashful about speaking up, too. Cedric looked to Cassidy. Has Dr. Acosta given you any grief? Cassidy snorted. He passed out almost as soon as we got back to camp. I've got him under guard, but he hasn't budged in hours. The posse rumbled back toward Driftwood. Their golf cart struggled on the last leg of the journey, being much the worse for wear after the tough journey. It's too bad we can't bring these people back with us when we go. Ember shook her head and sighed. This is a harsh place to live. You can't create another portal when we get back? Ember shook her head. The membrane between this dimension and our own is strengthening. We were lucky to be able to make it across the first time. Cedric nodded. He watched the jagged, rocky landscape roll by without speaking for a time. This place has its own kind of beauty, he said. I mean, it's rough and there's monsters around every corner, but it's kind of neat. You're not wrong, but I miss the sun, and the moon, and chocolate chip cookies, and turning off the bathtub with my toes. Cedric chuckled, tossing a smile her way before returning his gaze to the road. I'll be glad to get back too. I wonder if they're missing us yet. Ember shook her head. I don't think so. Portal magic isn't my strong suit, but Ash seems to think we'll appear mere seconds after we left. Good. I'd hate to think of what my deputies would do while I was gone. You don't trust them? No, they'll figure out they don't really need me to do their jobs, Cedric cackled. His laughter faded, and he turned a somber gaze on Ember. You're bound and determined to cross that sea one way or another, aren't you? Yes, Ember said firmly. That's exactly what I'm going to do. I can see there's no talking you out of it, despite the danger. What if the gigantic dragon comes back? Ember shuddered. Hopefully Amelia Earhart's plane can outrun him. He didn't seem to have an exceedingly high maximum velocity. He didn't need it. That monster is so big he affects the local weather patterns when he flies. Ember gestured toward the front of the line. It looks like the lead vehicles have made it back to Driftwood. I'm not going to miss Driftwood. Cedric's brows came low over his narrowed eyes. They're entirely too reactionary for my taste. Otherwise, Romulus wouldn't be able to whip them into a frenzy so easily. Remember, Cedric, there are no guarantees for these people. Ember cast a worried frown his way. They don't know for sure if their beetstock crop is going to get blight or a dragon's going to come knocking on their front door. That level of anxiety makes them easy prey for men like Romulus. He wanted to make you his empress? You're never going to let me live that down, are you? Nope. Ember laughed helplessly and looked over at Cedric. His strong jaw and piercing eyes seemed all the more handsome for the happy smile on his face. She almost felt like it was old times when he still had his memories. Cedric turned his gaze back to the path ahead and scowled. What's this now? The vehicles ahead of them had ground to a halt, abandoned by their operators. Cedric steered the golf cart around and rode on the sloped edge of the road. Ember yelped when he hit a particularly large rock, and the cart took a bad bounce. For heaven's sake, just park the cart and we'll walk, Ember gasped. I'd rather not have a wreck. Good point. Cedric pulled the cart onto the road beside a patchwork dirt bike, and they walked the rest of the way into town. What's going on? Ember snapped her gaze about as the townsfolk moved hurriedly toward City Hall. Didn't you hear? An old prospector limped up toward them, a bundle of goods rattling on his back. Romulus called for a vote of no confidence in Amelia Earhart. He went on his way as if that explained everything. Ember and Cedric exchanged worried glances. "We'd better get to City Hall. Fast." Chapter 30. Ember and Cedric fought their way through the milling throng gathered outside of City Hall. It seemed the entire populace of Driftwood had emptied into the streets. Not only that, but they all had opinions about the upcoming vote and were highly vocal about them. "Mayor Earhart is out of touch with the common Driftwood citizen," shouted a man in farmer's garb who looked suspiciously like one of Hoffa's men. He cupped his hands around his mouth as he called, "We need a man of the people." Many in the crowd cheered his proclamation, while others tried to shout it down. "You're all fools if you want to turn over our governance to dictators and gangsters," shouted a man Ember had seen working in City Hall. "You'll let them lead us all to ruin." "This place is like a powder keg," Cedric said as he muscled his way through the press of humanity. "All it will take is the tiniest spark and there'll be blood in the streets." Ember followed in his wake as they made for the front of the crowd. Ember made it through at last, staggering a few steps and nearly colliding with Constable Cassidy and the kid. They acted as ballot security, monitoring each person who came up to vote. A Driftwood denizen would shuffle forward at their signal and drop a stone into one of 3 wooden boxes. Ember grew alarmed at the fact there were 3 ballot boxes, and that so few stones seemed to occupy Mayor Earhart's container. "Romulus is obviously running against her," Ember said. "But who's running against them?" "At your service, ma'am." They turned about to find Jimmy Hoffa striding forward, flanked by armed goons. His ever-present toothpick moved about as his lips twisted into a grin. "I figure I've got management skills. Why not throw my hat in the ring? Can't do a worse job than the current administration." Ember rolled her eyes and moved over to where Mayor Earhart anxiously watched the proceedings. "What happened? Why are they trying to get you out of office all of a sudden?" Mayor Earhart grimaced. "Because I let Dr. Acosta go, seeing as Mr. Bierce recanted his testimony. People claim they want justice, but what they really want is a spectacle and some form of closure afterward. They want to cheer, they want to boo, and then they want it all wrapped up in a neat little bow at the end. They're just using this matter to grab power for themselves," Cedric growled. "It's not right or decent." "It is what it is," Mayor Earhart said with a shrug. "It's a miracle we keep this ragtag group of survivors together as a community at all. If I've not been pulling my weight in that regard, well, I guess maybe I deserve to lose my job." "Do you really think Jimmy Hoffa or Emperor Romulus will do a better job than you?" Ember shook her head. "Get real. They have their own agendas, and those agendas have nothing to do with what's best for the community as a whole." "You think I don't know that?" Mayor Earhart sighed. "I just have to put my faith in the people and hope they vote for sanity instead of empty grandiose promises." Cedric sighed. "Cedric, not now," Ember said. They watched as the citizens of Driftwood came forward one by one to cast their votes. Over time, Mayor Earhart's container grew fuller. Soon it became difficult to guess which of the 3 candidates had won. "I wish Jimmy Hoffa would just find a hole to crawl into," Ember muttered. Cassidy snickered. "Agreed. Even if he doesn't win this election, I suspect he's going to be a thorn in my side for some time to come, unless he chokes on that fishbone of his. Here's hoping." Ember snorted. "Normally I hate to wish ill on others, but I can't say I'd shed a tear if he were to choke and stop causing all this trouble." She waited excitedly as the election wound down. "Can't they count any faster?" Ember asked, impatience tearing through her. "Any faster and they'd make mistakes and need to do a recount," Cassidy said. "No, it's worked this long. We should just let them take their time as they tally the results. Besides, it looks like they're done now." To Ember's immense relief, Mayor Earhart won her re-election bid. It had been close, coming down to just 7 votes in her favor. "I was never worried at all," Cassidy said, shaking off his own anxiety. "Like shooting fish in a barrel." "Did you say fish?" Ember asked. "In a barrel?" "Yes, I did," Cassidy replied. "What of it?" Ember was having an epiphany. All of a sudden, it became very clear to her. Everything fell into place. As the crowd noise increased, the constables struggling to maintain order, Ember worked her way over to Mayor Earhart. "Congratulations." "Thank you." "I know who killed D.B. Cooper," Ember said, "and I can prove it, but I need your help." Earhart cocked an eyebrow. "Name it." Ember nodded and told the mayor her plan. Chapter 31. The election gave the people of Driftwood an excuse for revelry, and they indulged in the extreme. Celebrations continued for hours afterward, as Ember and her companions put the plan into motion. Ember and Cedric clung to the shadows of an upended oil tanker-turned-grain silo. The silo sat on the edge of Driftwood. Occasional flashes of lightning turned the scene bright as day. A short distance away, Mayor Earhart stood in the open, arms crossed over her chest as she looked anxiously about. "Are you sure it's a good idea to use her as bait to catch our killer?" Cedric whispered. Ember's belly turned flip-flops. "I hate to put her out there like this, but she volunteered. She's not a woman averse to risks, obviously." "Yes. You don't try to fly around the entire planet if you're the timid type. Do you think they'll show?" "They'll show," Kaylee said, peering out from behind Ember's leg. "In fact, I can see someone coming now." It took Ember and Cedric a moment longer to recognize the approaching figure, without the benefit of feline night vision. Emperor Romulus came into the clearing before the ship silo, his venerable features contorting into a scowl. "Cedric, why would you have me sneak about in the ruins of your crumbling city like a common thief? Could we not have handled this in your office?" Cedric and Ember shrunk back as Mayor Earhart cocked an eyebrow at the Emperor. "Well, good evening to you too, Mr. Congeniality. And I picked this spot because it gives us privacy. My office has eyes and ears." Romulus squared up with the mayor, his face crossed with a suspicious scowl. "Why should that matter? Transfers of this magnitude are best done where there are many witnesses." Romulus spun about in a tight circle, drawing his blade with a practiced snap of his arm. Jimmy Hoffa paused at the edge of the clearing, his eyes cold as he stared down the Emperor. "Are you kidding me? What's this toga-wearing clown doing here?" He shifted the bone pick in his mouth from one side of his mouth to the other, as his gaze darted between Romulus and Mayor Earhart. "I was about to ask you the same question, knave." "Miss Earhart, I suggest you tell this fool to stop pointing that sword at me, or I'll make him eat it." "Ha!" Romulus took a step toward Hoffa. "If you tire of life so, then by all means, quench my blade's bloodthirst." "Gentlemen, behave," Mayor Earhart said, interposing herself between the two of them. "Now is not the time for violence." "Then what time is it, Toots?" Hoffa shot her a sneering smile. "You told me that you were ready to concede the election to me." "Liar," Romulus sputtered. "She will be conceding, but not to you. I will be the ruler of the land both above and below, mightier than Zeus and Hades combined." "Gentlemen," Mayor Earhart said in a firmer tone, "I did invite both of you here, that's true. I never said anything about conceding." "The heck you didn't," Hoffa said with a sneer. "I recall you promising exactly such," Romulus huffed. "No. Specifically, what I said was I wanted to discuss the election's results. I just knew that with your naturally gigantic egos, you'd assume that I was going to capitulate and hand over the mayorship to you." Hoffa laughed, then clapped in a condescending manner. "Gold star for you. Really pulled the wool over my eyes. Why did you want us to come here?" "Yes, why?" Romulus sheathed his sword and glared at Mayor Earhart. Earhart grinned and looked over her shoulder to Ember. "You want to take it from here, Mrs. McNair?" Ember strode into the clearing. "With pleasure." "What is this sorceress doing here?" Romulus took a step back and made a sign to ward against evil in the air. "This broad again," Hoffa said, rolling his eyes. "Why is it that every time there's a pain in my posterior, you're somehow in the middle of it?" "I gathered the two of you here tonight," Ember said, drawing all gazes to herself, "because one of you is the man who killed D.B. Cooper." Lightning flashed overhead as Romulus' jaw dropped open. He stared at Ember, aghast, offended at the mere suggestion he could be guilty. Hoffa, by comparison, laughed and shook his head, as if Ember were a cute puppy who'd performed a trick. How dare you accuse me of such a heinous crime? Oh, come on, witchy poo. Hoffa heaved an exasperated sigh. I lost the election. What more do you want? Why do you have to try and pinch me for Coop getting offed, too? Romulus pointed at Mayor Earhart. You are just as much a suspect as the two of us, if not more so. You were the one who shared Cooper's bed, and he broke your heart. Settle down, Ember said, using magic to augment her edict. Her voice echoed loud in their ears, mingling with the thunder in a cacophony of intimidating dissonance. The clearing fell silent. That's better. Now, it's true that all three of you are the appropriate height to be our killer, namely under 5.5 feet tall. It's also true that each of you has a motive for wanting Cooper dead. Again with this, Hoffa said, rolling his eyes as if the entire affair were beneath him. In your case, Mr. Hoffa, Cooper's death gives you access to his share of your moonshine operation, significantly increasing your wealth. I've got plenty of wealth. You really think I'm that greedy? Ember ignored him, turning next to Emperor Romulus. You could easily use a proxy war between Hoffa and Joe Magnano to sow enough chaos to possibly seize power in Driftwood. Also, it was one of your swords we found stuck in the victim's back. With reluctance, Ember turned at last to Mayor Earhart. And you, Madame Mayor, had a prior intimate relationship with the deceased. All of you could be considered suspects, but only one of you is the killer. Who? Romulus, Hoffa, and Earhart demanded all at once. Ember spun toward the killer and pointed her finger. You. You killed D.B. Cooper. Chapter 32. You're talking out of your keister, lady, Jimmy Hoffa said with a sneer. I don't have to sit here and listen to this crap. Actually, you do. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid strode into the clearing. He rested a hand on his revolver, eyes daring Hoffa to make a move. Now that the gang's all here, let's get this party started. Cedric looked to Ember. You've got the proof, right? Thanks to me, I found it, Kaylee pointed out. Yes, I've got it right here. Ember patted her pocket. We just need the original to match it up. Come here, Hoffa, let me see that thing in your teeth. Cassidy reached for Hoffa's face. Keep your hands to yourself, you filthy animal, Hoffa snapped. A scuffle ensued, with Emperor Romulus eagerly joining the fray. You wish him to unclench his jaw? Romulus snapped a right hook into Hoffa's face, laying him low. Ember gasped at the sudden display of violence. Cedric crouched in the ground near Hoffa's feet, lifting the bit of fishbone from the turf with a ginger grip. Here, Ember said, using a spell to float the bone into the air before her. She dug the sliver of bone Kaylee found at the crime scene from her pocket. Let's see if these fit. The bits came together in midair and Ember grinned. Perfectly. So Hoffa killed Coop? Cassidy asked. Yes, he had motive, opportunity, and we can link him to the crime scene. If you're still in doubt, we can lift his prints, now that he's unconscious. Prints? Fingerprints, Mayor Earhart said. They used them to exonerate the doctor in the Lindbergh baby case, if I recall. Constable Cassidy, let Sheriff Cedric show you how to take fingerprints. At any rate, I'm satisfied justice has been done. How about you, Emperor? Quite. He sneered down at Hoffa before gathering up his robes and trundling off. I must away from you peasants. Don't do us any favors, Kaylee quipped. Now, Mayor Earhart said, favoring Ember with a wide grin, I believe we have a plane to catch. The Electra proved much smaller than Ember had expected. She eyed the propeller plane dubiously, feeling that it seemed primitive to her eye. Amelia Earhart's ground crew rushed about, doing last-minute preparations. How wide do you figure the sea is? Ember asked as Earhart climbed behind the pilot's console in the cockpit. Not sure, Earhart said. We'll head out until just under half our fuel is gone, and then turn back if we don't find shore. Ember nodded. She sat in the back next to Cedric and the excited April. I've never flown on a plane before, she said. This one seems really old. Mayor Earhart really likes this plane, April. Don't be rude. Well, it does, April said, peering out the window. Sit down and strap in, little lady, Cedric said gently. April's face twisted into a demonic sneer. Why don't you strap your face in? Leave me alone. Munkalok ran into the back of the plane. Ember sighed and shook her head. Hopefully we're in for a smooth ride. I don't have it in me to deal with Munkalok at the moment. The plane taxied about and tore down the runway. Ember held her breath as the wheels left the sandy plain. To her relief, the plane continued to climb, then soar high in the red skies. Are we in danger from the lightning? Ember asked. Like terrestrial lightning, it will pass through an ungrounded target. We'll try to avoid the worst of it. They sailed over the crawling sea below. Ember tried to find the beach where she and Cedric had enjoyed a brief rest, but they flashed by it too quickly. What about dragons? April asked. Don't worry, Earhart replied. They don't like going out over the ocean. Oh, April said. I wanted to fly next to a dragon. She rushed off into the rear of the plane. Ember put her hands on her hips and glared into the darkness. April, get back here and put on your seatbelt. It's dangerous to run around. There was no reply. Ember peered into the shadows at the rear of the plane and frowned. April? Guess again. Jimmy Hoffa strutted out into view, one hand clamped around April's mouth, the other holding a pistol to her head. Hoffa, Ash scowled. Why aren't you in jail? I'm one slippery SOB, what can I say? Now tell me the truth. You've got a way back to the real world, don't you? Well, you're taking me with you. Cedric reached for his service pistol, but Hoffa shook his head. I don't think so. Take it out with your left hand, lay it on the floor, and kick it over to me. Hey, what's going on back there? Earhart cried. We have a stowaway, Ember said in a growl. Mr. Hoffa is here. Well, shoot him or something. He has April. Earhart cursed. I knew it was too good to be true when I spotted land. You can see the other side? Cedric asked. Yeah, I think I see a flat plane I can land on, as well. Might want to tell Mr. Hoffa to buckle up, because it's going to be a bumpy landing. Hoffa marched April over to the opposite row of side-facing seats. He held his own gun to April's head and pointed Cedric's at Ash. You, Missy, get over here and put on our seatbelts. And don't try anything, or I'll spatter this kid's brains all over the cabin. You're a monster, Ash said, even as she went to do as he commanded. Once he was buckled in, she secured April and went back to her own seat. I'm putting us down, Earhart said. It's going to be bumpy. Hoffa, how about you do us all a favor and take the gun away from the girl's head? Not a chance. You better make that landing butter smooth. Ember sat on a razor's edge watching Hoffa's trigger finger while the plane came in for a landing. She bounced about in her seat, silently praying the gun wouldn't go off. She nearly fainted with relief when the plane rolled to a stop on the sandy plains. Everybody out, Hoffa said. Except you, Madam Mayor. You're staying right where you are. We've got a lot to discuss on the trip back to Driftwood. We can't take you with us, Hoffa, Cedric growled. You won't survive. Ember thinks you'll age to your real chronological levels and turn to dust. That's a risk I'm willing to take, Hoffa said with a sneer. It's better than waiting around to die in Driftwood. Hoffa herded them out onto the sand. They left the plane behind and made for a rise in the terrain ahead. Ash's divining rod led them right to the doorstep of a dark cave. Cedric's memories are definitely in here, Ash said. Memories? Hoffa sneered. I thought you were looking for a way back to Earth? Ember didn't answer, and Hoffa shrugged. Whatever. Go ahead, make with the fancy green lights. My boys told me all about you, witch. Ember sighed and created the illumination globes. They entered the cave, Hoffa bringing up the rear, both guns sticking in April's back. Ember found herself in a similar cave network to the one below the boulder field. The undulating, water-shaped walls adopted a bowstring-straight symmetry. Ember's feet walked upon tiled floor rather than uneven cavern rock. They entered a large underground antechamber, the ceiling held aloft by smoothly carved columns. "This doesn't look like human architecture," Cedric said with a frown. "Maybe it isn't," Ember replied. Ash pointed her divining rod at the wall, where a clay urn sat on the floor. Arcane sigils snaked around its painted surface, some of them glowing for brief moments. "His memories are in there," Ash said. Ember forgot about Hoffa for a moment and knelt next to the urn. She lifted it carefully from the floor and cradled it in her hands. Cedric hovered nearby, sweat standing out on his brow. "Can you open it?" he asked. "It's not that simple," Ember said. "Your memories are suspended in a magic field contained inside of this urn. Breaking it could mean they'll be lost forever." "Then what are we going to do?" Cedric asked in alarm. "We need to find a spell that will transfer them from the urn back into you." Ember pursed her lips as she cradled the urn. "That is, if such a spell even exists." "It does, and we'll find it," Ash said firmly. "Hey, what am I, chopped liver?" Hoffa fired a round into the air, causing everyone to start. "I don't give a crap about any dusty old jars of dirt. I want to get home, and I want to get home now." Ember looked to Ash. "Use your pendant?" Ash nodded. She tugged the crystal pendant off of her neck and looked around at everyone. "The portal will only be open for a few seconds, so there's no time to dawdle." "Get on with it," Hoffa said, desperation creeping into his tone. "I want to get home. And this kid smells awful." "Speak for yourself, loser," Munkalok snarled. He bit the hand holding Cedric's revolver viciously. Ash lashed out with a spell that created an energy whip, which wrapped around Hoffa's other arm. "I'll take that," Cedric said, grabbing the gun from his hand. Munkalok succeeded in wresting the other pistol from Hoffa's grasp. "What should we do with him?" Ash asked. "Take him with us," Ember replied. "We can't leave him here to plague the people of Driftwood, and besides, maybe he will crumble to dust. It would be what he deserved." "We'll let the universe take care of it," Cedric said with a grin. Ash nodded. She chanted a single command word and tossed the crystal on the floor. It shattered with a sound akin to a hammer smashing a glass bottle. Ember winced at the jarring sound as an incredible tempest sprung up around them. The portal was even stronger than the one which brought them across dimensions. Ember found her feet sliding along as she was sucked toward the shimmering circle of light. Ash disappeared into it first, then Cedric and April. Ember took a step toward the portal and found herself drawn into a headlong run. The winds tore at her back, driving her through the portal at a stumble. She passed through blinding light and then found herself staggering across her own back lawn. Ember looked up at the blue skies overhead and smiled. "We did it," she said, smiling at her family. "We made it back." Hoffa flew out of the portal and slammed hard into Ember's shoulder. She stumbled a few feet and the urn flew out of her grasp. Ember stared in horror as it spun through the air toward the ground, where it would surely shatter. When it did, Cedric's memories would be lost forever.